The dust of Redemption Creek clung to everything, to the worn boots of the onlookers, to the tattered dresses of the women, and most intensely, to the raw, parched throats of those gathered. The year was 1888, and the sun beat down with a relentless fury that seemed to bake the very hope out of men's souls. In the center of the makeshift square, before the general store, stood a crude auction block, its wood scarred by countless transactions. On it, a young woman no older than 20 stood with her head bowed, her shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. Her name was Elara. Her dress, once a pale blue, was now faded and patched, a testament to a life lived on the fringes of survival. Her hair, the color of rich earth, was loose and partially obscured her face, but a few strands caught the sunlight, hinting at its potential beauty. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white against the tanned skin. Around her, a motley crowd of ranchers, prospectors, and saloon patrons muttered, their voices a low, predatory hum. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, stale whiskey, and desperation. Elara's father, Elias, a trapper whose luck had run dry with the last winter's pelts, stood nearby, his face a mask of shame and anguish. He had borrowed heavily from Jebediah Thorne, the town's shrewd and unforgiving merchant, and the debt had spiraled beyond his meager means. Now the collateral was his daughter. A gasp, a whispered protest from a few women in the crowd, quickly died down under Thorne's withering stare. Thorne, a portly man with beady eyes and a permanent sneer, relished these moments. He saw himself as an instrument of justice, even if that justice was cruel and self-serving. "All right, folks, listen up," Thorne's voice boomed, cutting through the murmurs like a rusted saw. He held a crumpled piece of paper, a document of Elara's indenture. "We have here Elara Vance, 20 years of age, strong of limb, healthy and ready for work. Her father, Elias Vance, has defaulted on his debts, and by the laws of this territory, his assets are forfeit. We start the bidding at $10. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. $10 for a woman, even a broken one, seemed a pittance. But this wasn't an auction for a prize mare. It was for a human being stripped of agency, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of the untamed West. Elara flinched at the sound of the first bid, a guttural 12 from a grizzled prospector whose eyes held an unsettling glint. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She tried to swallow, but her throat was too dry, the taste of fear metallic on her tongue. The bids slowly climbed, 15, 20, 25. Each number chipped away a piece of her already shattered spirit. She imagined the lives that awaited her. Endless drudgery, the loneliness of an isolated ranch, or worse, the indignity of a saloon. Her father clutched his worn hat, his eyes fixed on the dusty ground, unable to meet her gaze. The shame was a palpable thing, a heavy shroud settling over them both. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the growing din, deep and resonant, carrying an undeniable authority. $50. The crowd quieted, heads turning in unison towards the source. A man stood at the edge of the gathering, astride a powerful black stallion. He was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in dark, practical rancher's clothes. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, but the stern set of his jaw and the piercing intensity of his eyes were visible. This was Silas Blackwood, the notorious ranchero from the remote Blackwood Ranch, a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. His presence alone commanded attention. He was known for his ruthless business dealings, his vast land holdings, and the impenetrable fortress he had built around his heart. Thorne's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise in their depths. Silas Blackwood rarely frequented the town, preferring to send his foreman for supplies. His appearance was unexpected. $50, Thorne repeated, a new note of excitement in his voice. "From Mr. Blackwood. Do I hear more?" A hush fell over the crowd. No one dared to bid against Silas Blackwood. His reputation preceded him. Crossing him was an invitation to trouble. The prospector who had started the bidding muttered under his breath and stepped back. Silas Blackwood dismounted with an effortless grace that belied his size. He walked towards the auction block, his spurs jingling softly, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Elara, trembling, finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his for a fleeting moment. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but held no hint of the leering interest she had seen in others. Instead, there was a stark, almost grim assessment. It was a gaze that saw beyond the broken exterior, perhaps into the very essence of her vulnerability. $50, going once, going twice, sold. To Mr. Silas Blackwood for $50, Thorne announced, slamming his gavel with a triumphant flourish. He then flashed a greasy smile at Silas. A fine acquisition, Mr. Blackwood. She'll serve you well. Silas ignored Thorne, his gaze still fixed on Elara. He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch, counting out 5 $10 gold pieces. The sound of the coins clinking together was sharp in the quiet air. Elias Vance, Elara's father, finally looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice raspy, "I thank you, sir. I never wanted this for her." Silas merely nodded, his expression unyielding. "She's mine now," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion yet not unkind. He then turned his attention back to Elara. "Come on." Elara hesitated, her mind reeling. She was bought by a man whose reputation was as dark and expansive as the land he owned. Yet there was something in his quiet command that lacked the malice she had feared. Slowly, she stepped down from the auction block, her legs unsteady. As she reached him, Silas gestured towards his horse. "You'll ride with me." He mounted first, then offered a hand. His touch was firm, calloused and surprisingly steady. Elara placed her small hand in his, and he pulled her up behind him with surprising gentleness. As she settled onto the horse, the rough fabric of his coat brushed against her, and she felt a strange mix of fear and an odd, unfamiliar sense of safety. The scent of leather, horse, and something uniquely masculine, perhaps the scent of the wilderness itself, filled her nostrils. Silas Blackwood didn't say another word. With a slight tug on the reins, he turned the stallion and rode out of Redemption Creek, leaving behind the dust, the whispers, and the life Elara had known. She clung to his waist, her face pressed against his back, watching the small, desolate town shrink into the horizon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the vast western sky in hues of orange and purple, mirroring the turmoil and nascent hope within her. She was heading into the unknown, bought by a man whose intentions remained a mystery, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a faint flicker of something other than despair. The broken woman had been bought, and her journey into a new, uncertain life had just begun. The ride to Blackwood Ranch was long and silent, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the sparse sagebrush. Elara clung to Silas Blackwood's waist, her small frame dwarfed by his. The afternoon sun, though beginning to wane, still held a biting heat, and the endless expanse of the rugged landscape felt both immense and suffocating. Every mile they covered took her further from the only life she had ever known, however meager it had been. She dared not speak, acutely aware of the formidable man in front of her. His back was a solid wall, radiating an aura of quiet power. She tried to discern his thoughts, his intentions, but he offered no clue. He hadn't uttered a single word since they left Redemption Creek, his silence as vast as the plains they traversed. What did he expect of her? What kind of life awaited her at Blackwood Ranch? The questions spun in her mind, a dizzying whirlwind of apprehension and a nascent, fragile curiosity. As the hours passed, Elara's initial shock began to give way to a weary resignation. Her body ached from the unaccustomed riding, and her throat felt raw from thirst. She risked a glance around, taking in the harsh beauty of the landscape. Towering rock formations, sculpted by millennia of wind and water, rose majestically in the distance, casting long purple shadows. Cacti, stoic and resilient, dotted the terrain, their spines glinting like tiny daggers. This was a land that demanded strength, a land that had little patience for the weak. Silas, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort, maintained a steady pace. He rode with an innate understanding of the land, his gaze scanning the horizon constantly, alert to every shifting shadow, every distant movement. He was a man perfectly attuned to his environment, a predator or a protector. She couldn't tell which. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep violets, the air grew cooler, bringing a welcome respite from the day's heat. Elara shivered, not just from the chill but from the realization that night was falling, and she was in an unfamiliar wilderness with a stranger. She instinctively tightened her grip on Silas, a small, involuntary movement. He must have felt it, for he finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. Cold? His voice was gruff, but there was no malice in it, only a simple inquiry. Elara nodded against his back, unable to find her voice. "We'll be there soon," he said, and then, to her surprise, he slowed the horse. He reached back with one hand, unfastening a thick wool blanket rolled behind his saddle. He didn't turn, but expertly unfolded it and, with a deft movement, wrapped it around her shoulders. The coarse wool was surprisingly warm, carrying a faint scent of wood smoke and saddle leather. It was a small gesture, almost negligible, but to Elara it felt like a lifeline. It was the first act of kindness she had received in days, perhaps weeks, and it brought a stinging sensation to her eyes. She blinked back the tears, refusing to show such vulnerability. She mumbled a barely audible, "Thank you." Silas merely grunted in response, and they continued their journey. The brief exchange, however, had broken the impenetrable wall of his silence, if only for a moment. It offered a glimpse, a fleeting hint, that beneath the formidable exterior there might be something more. The terrain grew steeper, the path narrower, as they began to ascend a series of low hills. Finally, as the last vestiges of daylight faded, Elara saw it, a cluster of buildings nestled in a wide natural hollow, protected by the surrounding hills. Blackwood Ranch. It was larger than she had imagined, a sprawling complex of sturdy log and stone structures. A main house, several bunkhouses, corrals, and a blacksmith's forge were all dimly lit by the flickering glow of lanterns. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, a comforting sight. The scent of wood smoke and cooking meat drifted on the evening breeze, making her stomach clench with hunger. As they approached, the barking of dogs erupted, followed by the sound of men's voices. Silas rode directly to the main corral, dismounting fluidly. Before he could turn, a young ranch hand, no older than Elara, rushed forward. "Mr. Blackwood, you're back. We were starting to worry." "Everything in order, Billy?" Silas asked, his voice calm. "Yes, sir. All quiet. Supper's ready," Billy replied, his gaze flickering nervously towards Elara. The ranch hand seemed surprised, perhaps even confused by her presence. Silas turned, reaching up to help Elara down. She swayed slightly as her feet touched the ground, her legs stiff and numb. He held her arm for a moment, steadying her, his grip surprisingly gentle. His eyes met hers again, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not curiosity, but perhaps a detached concern. "This is Elara," Silas announced to Billy, his voice even. "She'll be staying here." He didn't elaborate, and Billy, sensing the finality in his tone, simply nodded, his eyes wide with unspoken questions. Silas then led Elara towards the largest building, the main house. It was a solid, imposing structure, built to withstand the elements and the occasional hostile intruder. Inside, a warm, inviting light spilled from the windows. As they entered, the aroma of a hearty stew washed over her, and for the first time that day a genuine hunger gnawed at her. The interior of the house was surprisingly sparse but well kept. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a roaring fire crackling cheerfully within it. Rough-hewn wooden furniture filled the room, a sturdy table, several chairs, and a worn leather armchair. There were no frills, no decorative flourishes, just practicality. "Martha!" Silas called out, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. A woman emerged from a doorway leading to what Elara assumed was the kitchen. She was older, with a kind, weathered face framed by wisps of grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands were flour-dusted, and a warm smile touched her lips as she saw Silas. "Silas, you're back. Supper's almost ready." Her gaze then shifted to Elara, and her smile softened further. "And who is this lovely young lady?" Silas gave a brief, almost curt explanation. "This is Elara. She'll be helping out around the house. She's had a long day. Get her something to eat and show her to the spare room." Martha's eyes, though still kind, held a knowing look as she glanced at Elara's weary face and travel-stained clothes. She seemed to understand, without a single word, the unspoken story. "Of course, Silas. Welcome, dear," Martha said, her voice warm and maternal. She stepped forward, reaching out a hand to Elara. "Come, let's get you settled." Elara looked at Silas, unsure of what to do. He simply nodded, a silent dismissal. She turned and followed Martha, a strange mix of relief and trepidation washing over her. As she walked away, she felt Silas's gaze on her back, a weighty presence that lingered even after she had passed through the doorway. The spare room was small but clean, with a simple cot, a worn chest of drawers, and a single window overlooking the dark expanse of the ranch. Martha brought her a basin of warm water, a bar of soap, and a clean, if somewhat coarse, towel. "Take your time, dear. Supper will be ready when you are. You look like you've been through a storm." Elara could only manage a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Mum." As Martha left, closing the door softly behind her, Elara finally allowed herself to breathe. She was safe for now. The long, silent journey had ended, and she was at Blackwood Ranch, a place that promised both an uncertain future and a fragile hope for solace. She looked out the window at the vast star-studded sky, a canopy over the wild, untamed land. A new chapter of her life had truly begun, purchased for $50. A broken woman in a broken land, now under the roof of a man whose silent gestures held more questions than answers. The first few days at Blackwood Ranch were a blur of new sensations and quiet adjustments for Elara. Martha, the kind-hearted housekeeper, became her silent guide, showing her the routines of the household and offering a comforting presence without prying. The ranch itself was a world away from the dusty, chaotic streets of Redemption Creek. Here, life moved with a steady, purposeful rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the livestock. Elara found herself performing simple tasks, sweeping the floors, helping Martha in the kitchen, washing clothes by hand in large tubs. The work was physically demanding, but it offered a welcome distraction, a way to channel her restless energy and numb the lingering ache of her past. She worked diligently, her movements quiet and efficient, always careful not to draw attention to herself. Silas Blackwood was a constant yet distant presence. He was often out on the range from dawn till dusk, overseeing his cattle, riding fences or managing his hands. When he was in the house, his presence filled the room, a quiet intensity that Elara could feel even when her back was turned. He rarely spoke to her directly, his communication usually through Martha, or a curt, monosyllabic instruction. Yet, Elara often felt his gaze upon her, a brief, assessing look that held no judgment, only a deep, almost clinical observation. During meals, which were usually taken in silence around the large dining table, Silas sat at the head, his men scattered around. Elara would serve, moving discreetly, filling plates and pouring coffee. She learned quickly that his meals were usually brief, efficient affairs. He ate with a focused intensity, his mind seemingly elsewhere, already planning the next task. One evening, as Elara was clearing the table, a fork slipped from her grasp and clattered loudly against the wooden floor. She flinched, her heart leaping into her throat, bracing herself for a reprimand. Silas, who had been engrossed in a ledger, slowly lifted his head, his eyes dark and unreadable, fixed on her. "Careful," he simply said, his voice low, without a hint of anger. It wasn't a warning, merely an observation. Elara quickly bent down to retrieve the fork, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Sorry, sir," she murmured, clutching the utensil tightly. He simply returned to his ledger, the incident dismissed. But for Elara, it was a moment of stark relief. She had expected harshness, perhaps even anger, but had received only a mild caution. It was a subtle reassurance that while he demanded competence, he was not prone to cruelty. She began to observe Silas more closely, piecing together fragments of his character from these small interactions. He was a man of few words, but his actions often spoke volumes. He was fair to his men, though demanding. He knew every inch of his vast ranch, every cow, every detail of its operation. He exuded an aura of control, not just over his land and his men, but over himself. One afternoon, Elara was hanging laundry on the line behind the main house. The wind, a constant companion in this land, tugged at the sheets, making them snap like flags. She looked out at the rolling hills, the endless sky, and felt a pang of loneliness. It was a beautiful, wild place, but also isolating. She missed her father, even with all their struggles. Suddenly, she heard the rhythmic clang of a hammer against metal. Intrigued, she followed the sound to the blacksmith's forge, a separate building at the edge of the ranch. Through the open door, she saw Silas Blackwood himself, stripped to the waist, his powerful muscles rippling under the flickering light of the forge. He held a piece of glowing hot metal with tongs, expertly shaping it with powerful, precise blows of a hammer. Sweat glistened on his skin, reflecting the orange glow of the fire. He was not just a ranchero, he was a craftsman, a man who understood the raw power of metal and fire. His concentration was absolute, his brow furrowed in intense focus. Elara watched, mesmerized by the primal scene. The heat of the forge, the smell of coal and burnt metal, the sheer force of his movements. It was a display of raw, untamed strength, yet controlled with an artisan's finesse. He finished shaping the piece, plunging it into a barrel of water with a hiss and a cloud of steam. He then wiped his brow with the back of his hand, finally noticing her presence. His eyes, though still intense from his work, held a slight, almost imperceptible softening as they met hers. "Something you need?" he asked, his voice a little hoarser than usual from the exertion. Elara quickly shook her head. "No, sir, I heard the hammer. Didn't mean to disturb you." He simply nodded, not dismissing her, but returning his attention to the cooling metal. Elara, feeling she had intruded, silently retreated. But the image of Silas at the forge, a powerful figure shaping raw materials with his own hands, stayed with her. It added another layer to the enigma of the man who had bought her. Later that week, a small crisis erupted. A cow had strayed from the herd and become trapped in a ravine, her leg injured. Silas and a few of his men spent a grueling day trying to free her. Elara watched from a distance as they struggled, Silas leading the effort with unwavering determination. He worked tirelessly, his hands and clothes soiled with mud and blood, his face grim. When they finally managed to bring the cow back to the ranch, Silas personally tended to its injury, carefully splinting the leg. He moved with a quiet competence, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he ministered to the distressed animal. He stayed with the cow for hours, ensuring its comfort, his usually stern expression softened by a flicker of concern. Observing this, Elara began to understand that Silas Blackwood, despite his formidable reputation and stoic demeanor, possessed a deep sense of responsibility, not just for his property and his men, but for the creatures under his care. He was a man shaped by the harshness of the land, but not entirely hardened by it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elara began to shed some of her fear. The ranchero was not the monster she had imagined. He was complex, driven, and seemingly burdened by his own silent struggles. She was still a broken woman, but here in the vast expanse of Blackwood Ranch, under the watchful yet not unkind eyes of Silas, she began to find a fragile sense of purpose, a small corner where she could simply be, and perhaps, just perhaps, begin to heal. The unspoken rules of the ranch, the quiet rhythm of its life, and the subtle observations of its formidable owner were slowly, gently, guiding her towards a new understanding of her place in this wild, untamed world. Weeks turned into months at Blackwood Ranch, and Elara's routine solidified. She still helped Martha, cooked for the ranch hands, and kept the main house meticulously clean. The physical labor, initially daunting, had begun to build strength in her slender frame. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused, a testament to her resilience. The sharp edges of her grief, though still present, had dulled, replaced by a quiet acceptance of her new reality. Silas Blackwood remained a man of few words, his presence a constant yet distant anchor in her life. Their interactions were brief and functional, but Elara had grown accustomed to his quiet intensity. She no longer flinched when he entered a room, nor did she avert her gaze as quickly. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the slight tightening of his jaw that indicated frustration, the rare, almost imperceptible nod of approval. One particularly harsh winter evening, a blizzard swept through the territory, trapping everyone indoors. The wind howled like a banshee around the sturdy walls of the ranch house, and the temperature plummeted. The men gathered in the bunkhouse, playing cards and telling stories, while Martha and Elara prepared a large stew in the main house. Silas sat by the roaring fireplace, cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic click-clack of the mechanism a familiar sound. Elara, chopping vegetables at the kitchen counter, found herself humming a faint, melancholic tune. It was an old lullaby her mother used to sing, a melody filled with bittersweet memories. She hadn't realized she was humming aloud until the sound of the rifle cleaning stopped. She froze, her heart momentarily seizing. Had she disturbed him? She glanced over her shoulder. Silas was looking at her, his rifle resting across his lap. His expression was unreadable as usual, but his eyes held a softness she hadn't seen before. "That's a pretty tune," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, cutting through the storm's wail. Elara's cheeks flushed. She hadn't expected him to speak, let alone comment on her singing. It's an old one," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze still on her. "Your mother sing it?" The question caught her off guard. It was the most personal question he had ever asked. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "Yes," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "When I was little." Silas didn't push. He simply watched her for a moment longer, then returned to his rifle. The moment passed, but it left a lingering warmth in Elara's chest. It was a small act of empathy, a recognition of her past and her humanity that transcended their buyer-bought relationship. It was a glimmer of something resembling trust, a subtle acknowledgement that she was more than just a hired hand. Later that evening, after the stew was served and the men had retreated, Silas remained by the fire. Martha had gone to bed, leaving Elara to tidy up. The blizzard raged outside and the isolation of the ranch felt absolute. Elara brought Silas a fresh cup of coffee, setting it on the small table beside his armchair. "Thank you, Elara," he said, taking the cup. His fingers, large and calloused, brushed hers briefly, sending a faint tingle through her hand. She nodded, turning to leave. But then, to her surprise, he spoke again. "It's a bad one tonight. The cattle will be hurting." His voice held a note of concern, a vulnerability she hadn't often heard. Elara hesitated, then sat down on a nearby chair, drawn by his unexpected candor. "I hope they'll be all right, sir," he sighed, gazing into the dancing flames. "They're tough, but even tough things break sometimes." His words seemed to carry a deeper meaning, a reflection perhaps of his own experiences. This land, it doesn't give anything easily. It takes and takes, until you learn to fight back, or you break. Elara listened, captivated. It was the longest she had ever heard him speak, and his words painted a vivid picture of the harsh existence they all shared. She thought of her own brokenness, her own losses. "My father, he just couldn't keep fighting," she said softly, a confession escaping her lips. Silas turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Some men aren't built for it," he acknowledged, his voice devoid of judgment. "Doesn't make them any less of a man, just different." He paused, then added, "He tried, Elara. He fought for you." His words were a balm to her soul. She had carried a heavy burden of shame, believing her father weak, ashamed of her own helpless situation. Silas's simple words, spoken with such understanding, lifted a small part of that weight. A single tear escaped and tracked a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. "You're strong, Elara," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "I've seen it. You've adapted. You work hard. That's what matters here." Elara looked down at her hands, surprised by his assessment. She had never considered herself strong. Broken, yes, resilient, perhaps, but strong. His words resonated, planting a seed of self-worth in the barren landscape of her spirit. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault. In the quiet warmth of the ranch house, a fragile bridge of understanding had begun to form between the broken woman and the stoic ranchero. It wasn't love, or even friendship, but a nascent respect, a recognition of shared resilience in the face of a brutal world. For Elara, it was a profound shift. The man who had bought her, the silent, formidable Silas Blackwood, was slowly revealing glimpses of a complex humanity, and with each glimpse, a tiny fragment of her own wounded heart began to mend. The glimmer of trust, born from a shared moment of vulnerability in the midst of a raging storm, promised a path forward, however uncertain. Despite the growing comfort Elara found at Blackwood Ranch, the shadows of her past lingered, occasionally resurfacing to remind her of the fragility of her new existence. Her dreams were often troubled, filled with distorted memories of the auction block, her father's despair, and the predatory gazes of men she'd rather forget. She would often wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, only to be comforted by the familiar creaks and groans of the old ranch house. One sunny afternoon, while gathering eggs from the chicken coop, Elara overheard a hushed conversation between two of the ranch hands, Billy and a gruff older man named Jed. They were talking about Silas Blackwood's past, their voices low, almost reverent. "Remember when his wife, Sarah, died?" Jed murmured, shaking his head. "God, that was a brutal winter. Fever took her and the babe. Almost took Silas, too. But he's too stubborn to die. Billy nodded solemnly. Yeah, I remember. He changed after that. Went from being a fair man to a stone wall. Never saw him laugh again, never saw him look at a woman again either. Until now. His voice trailed off, and Elara heard the unspoken question in his words. Elara froze, an egg clutched in her hand. Silas had been married. He had lost a wife and a child. The revelation hit her with unexpected force. It explained so much. His stoicism, his carefully guarded emotions, the deep-seated sadness she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. His heart wasn't just hardened by the land, it was scarred by profound loss. She felt a strange mixture of pity and a deeper understanding. He was not just a strong, silent figure. He was a man who had loved and lost, who carried his own invisible wounds. Her own brokenness suddenly felt less unique, more connected to a universal human experience. Later that day, as she was sweeping the main room, her gaze lingered on a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was the only decorative item in the otherwise austere room. It depicted a smiling woman with bright eyes and a cascade of dark, curly hair. She was beautiful, radiating warmth and vitality. Next to her, a younger Silas, his arm around her, a genuine, joyful smile on his face, a smile Elara had never seen. This was Sarah. Elara reached out a tentative finger, tracing the outline of Sarah's face. She felt a pang of something akin to jealousy, but it was quickly overshadowed by a profound sadness. This woman, this beautiful, happy woman, was gone, and with her, a part of Silas. The photograph was a silent testament to a love that had been, and a happiness that was no more. She was so absorbed in the photograph that she didn't hear Silas enter the room. His voice, close behind her, made her jump. She was my wife. Elara spun around, her face flushed with embarrassment at being caught prying. I'm so sorry, sir, I didn't mean to. He held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes were fixed on the photograph, a distant, haunted look in their depths. No need to apologize. Her name was Sarah. His voice was low, almost a whisper, filled with a raw emotion she rarely heard from him. We were married for 3 years. She was everything. He walked over to the mantelpiece, his large hand reaching out, not quite touching the frame. We were going to build a life here, a family. She was pregnant when the fever took her, took both of them. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, a rare fissure in his impenetrable facade. Elara stood in silence, her heart aching for him. The sheer magnitude of his loss, articulated in such a stark, simple way, was devastating. She could feel the weight of his grief, a palpable presence in the room. After that, he continued, his gaze still fixed on Sarah's smiling face, I just built this ranch, built walls around myself, didn't want to feel that kind of pain again. He finally looked at Elara, his eyes raw with unspoken sorrow. It's easier to be alone, Elara, easier not to care. His confession, so raw and unexpected, stripped away layers of his formidable exterior. Elara saw not just the stoic ranchero, but the heartbroken man who had retreated into himself, burying his pain under layers of work and solitude. I understand, Elara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Losing someone you love, it changes you. It makes you afraid to feel. She thought of her own father, his broken spirit, the silent death of her mother years before. Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected pity, perhaps, or awkward silence, but not such a profound understanding. He saw the shared pain in her eyes, the echoes of her own losses. Yes, he finally said, his voice a little stronger. It does. He turned away from the fireplace, picking up his hat from a nearby peg. There's work to be done. The moment was over, the confession sealed away again, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Elara no longer saw him as just her owner, or a distant figure of authority. She saw a man wounded and deeply scarred, much like herself. His grief mirrored her own, creating a silent bond of shared suffering. As Silas left the house, the door closing softly behind him, Elara remained by the fireplace, her gaze fixed on Sarah's smiling face. She understood now why he had bought her, a broken woman, at an auction. Perhaps in some unspoken way, he saw a reflection of his own lost hope in her, a chance to perhaps, just perhaps, rescue something from the wreckage of his own past, even if he didn't fully realize it himself. The shadows of his past, once a mystery, were now illuminated, revealing a path towards a deeper, more profound connection, one built on the fragile foundation of shared human sorrow. The conversation about Sarah had subtly changed the dynamic between Elara and Silas. An unspoken understanding now existed, a fragile thread woven between their shared experiences of loss. Silas, while still reserved, allowed for moments of quiet vulnerability, and Elara, in turn, felt a growing confidence in his presence. She no longer walked on eggshells around him, sensing that beneath his stern exterior lay a deeply wounded, yet fundamentally decent man. One evening, a fierce dust storm descended upon the ranch. The air turned a thick, choking red-brown, visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind howled with an unnatural ferocity, rattling windows and threatening to tear shingles from the roof. The ranch hands huddled indoors, their faces grim, knowing such storms could cause serious damage and put the livestock at risk. Elara was in the kitchen with Martha, trying to prepare supper amidst the swirling dust that seeped through every crevice. The lantern light struggled against the gloom, casting dancing shadows that made the familiar kitchen seem eerie and unsettling. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed from the back of the house, followed by a splintering sound. Martha gasped, dropping a pot. Good heavens, what was that? Silas, who had been in his office, strode out, his face grim. Sounds like the back wall of the stable. The wind must have taken it. He grabbed his oilskin coat and hat. I have to go check on the horses. Silas, no, it's too dangerous, Martha cried, her voice filled with fear. You can barely see out there. I can't leave them out there in this, he stated, his voice firm, already moving towards the door. They'll panic. Could break their legs. Elara watched him, her heart pounding. The thought of him going out into that maelstrom filled her with dread. She remembered his confession about Sarah, the pain of loss. She didn't want to see him hurt, or worse. An instinct, raw and powerful, surged through her. I'll come with you, she blurted out, surprising even herself. Silas paused at the door, turning slowly. His eyes, usually unreadable, now held a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of concern for her. No, Elara, it's too dangerous. Stay inside. I can help, she insisted, her voice trembling but resolute. I can hold a lantern. I can see better up close than you can in this. Please, sir. She knew it was a desperate plea, but she couldn't stand by while he faced such a risk alone. He stared at her for a long moment, assessing her determination. He saw not just fear, but a flicker of the same resilience he had praised weeks ago. Perhaps he saw a shared understanding of what it meant to face a storm, both literal and metaphorical. Finally, he gave a curt nod. All right, but stay close, and do exactly as I say. Martha wrung her hands. Be careful, both of you. Elara quickly grabbed a thick coat and a sturdy lantern, lighting its wick. As she stepped out into the raging dust storm behind Silas, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of red dust and howling wind. The air was thick, gritty, and incredibly loud. She could barely see Silas, even though he was only a few feet in front of her. She instinctively reached out, grabbing the back of his coat, needing a tether to reality. Silas, instead of pulling away, reached back and grasped her hand, his large calloused fingers closing firmly around hers. It was a simple, non-romantic gesture, born of necessity and survival, but for Elara, it was a lifeline. His hand was warm, steady, and strong, an anchor in the terrifying chaos. They stumbled forward, buffeted by the wind, Elara clinging to his hand, the lantern swinging wildly, its feeble light barely piercing the dust. The roar of the wind was deafening, making communication impossible. She focused solely on staying upright, on keeping hold of his hand, and on following his lead. When they finally reached the stable, the damage was evident. A large section of the back wall had indeed collapsed, leaving a gaping hole through which the dust and wind swirled furiously. Inside, the horses were in a frenzy, whinnying and rearing in their stalls, terrified by the breach. Silas immediately sprang into action. He released Elara's hand and moved swiftly, though carefully, through the stable, calling out to the horses in a calm, authoritative voice. "Whoa, boy. Easy now. Easy." He assessed the damage quickly. Some of the planks from the collapsed wall were dangerously loose, threatening to fall further and injure the animals. "Elara, hold the lantern steady right here," he shouted, pointing to a spot where she could illuminate a particularly unstable section. "Don't move." She did as she was told, holding the lantern with both hands, its light cutting through the swirling dust. Silas, with surprising agility, began to kick away loose debris, trying to clear a path. He then grabbed a thick rope from a nearby hook. "We need to secure this section. It'll take 2 of us." He handed her one end of the rope. "Wrap it around that post. Then pull. Hard." Elara, though small, put every ounce of her strength into the task. She wrapped the rope around the sturdy wooden post as instructed, digging her heels into the dirt floor and pulling with all her might. Silas, on the other side, was a force of nature, hauling on his end of the rope, using his immense strength to stabilize the damaged wall. Together they managed to secure the loose planks, preventing further collapse. They worked for what felt like an eternity, their faces and clothes caked with dust, their lungs burning. Silas ensured the horses were calmed and moved to the safer front stalls. He checked each animal, reassuring them with his touch and voice. Elara, holding the lantern, watched him, amazed by his resilience and his unwavering dedication. Finally, the worst of the immediate danger was averted. Silas, breathing heavily, wiped the dust from his face with the back of his hand. "All right," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "That's all we can do for now. Let's get back." He took her hand again and they slowly made their way back to the main house, battling against the relentless wind. This time, the silence between them was different. It was a silence of shared experience, of quiet respect forged in the crucible of danger. Back inside, Martha fussed over them, bringing warm water and clean towels. Elara looked at Silas, his face grimy, his hair matted with dust, but his eyes held a glint of satisfaction, a subtle warmth she hadn't seen before. "Thank you, Elara," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You did well, you kept your head." Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and something deeper. His acknowledgement, his simple words of gratitude, meant more than any formal thanks. In the chaos of the storm, a bond had been forged, a silent understanding that transcended their previous roles. He had offered her a hand in the darkness, and in doing so had allowed a new kind of light to enter her own wounded heart. The broken woman had found a fragile sense of purpose, not just in survival, but in shared struggle, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who had bought her. News traveled slowly in the rugged West, but it always found a way. The story of Silas Blackwood bringing a young woman from an auction in Redemption Creek and her subsequent quiet integration into the isolated Blackwood Ranch eventually reached the ears of those who frequented the saloons and general stores of neighboring towns. Whispers began to circulate, fueled by curiosity, speculation, and often malice. For Elara, life at the ranch continued its steady rhythm. The stable wall was repaired, the cattle weathered the storm, and the dust gradually settled. She found herself growing more comfortable, more confident. The memory of the dust storm and Silas's hand in hers had etched itself into her mind, a tangible reminder of a growing, unspoken connection. One brisk autumn morning, Silas informed Elara and Martha that he would be riding into the nearest town, Harmony Gulch, to pick up supplies and conduct some business. "Should be back by sundown," he stated, his usual brevity. Elara felt a pang of unease. Harmony Gulch was larger than Redemption Creek, and she knew that the kind of rumors that surrounded Silas and her own situation would thrive there. She worried about what people might say, what judgments they might cast. But she kept her concerns to herself. As Silas rode off, Martha seemed to sense her apprehension. "Don't you fret, child," she said, patting Elara's hand. "People will talk, no matter what you do. Silas doesn't pay them any mind, and neither should you." Despite Martha's reassurance, Elara couldn't shake the feeling of dread. She spent the day diligently working, but her mind kept drifting to Silas, picturing him in town, facing the stares and the whispers. She knew the kind of man he was. Proud, self-sufficient, and intensely private. The thought of him being subjected to gossip on her behalf filled her with a strange protectiveness. Meanwhile, in Harmony Gulch, Silas Blackwood dismounted his horse in front of the general store, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was a familiar figure, but his infrequent visits always caused a stir. As he tied his horse, he caught snippets of conversation, hushed and curious. "Heard he bought a woman at auction," a grizzled prospector muttered to a shopkeeper, his eyes darting towards Silas. "Aye," the shopkeeper replied, wiping his counter with a stained rag. "From Redemption Creek, they say. Poor thing. Wonder what he wants with her, way out there." Silas ignored them, striding into the general store with his usual purposeful gait. As he went about his business, checking lists and talking to the store owner about supplies, he overheard more. Silas Blackwood, the man of ice, taking in a stray. Someone chuckled from a corner. Figures he'd buy his company rather than court it. A woman whispered, "They say her father sold her for debt. Shameful, really. What kind of life will she have with a man like him?" The comments, though not directly aimed at him, reached Silas. His jaw tightened, a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He was accustomed to rumors about his wealth, his ruthlessness, his solitude. But these whispers were different. They touched on Elara, on her vulnerability, on the very act of charity or whatever he had done that he had extended. He felt an unfamiliar surge of anger, a protectiveness he hadn't realized had taken root. He finished his transactions, his movements stiff, his expression even more unyielding than usual. As he stepped out of the store, he saw a group of men gathered near his horse, their eyes on him, their murmurs growing bolder. "Heard she's a pretty one, Silas," one of them, a loud-mouthed rancher named Cal, called out, a leering grin on his face. "Got her for a steal, didn't you? What kind of work does she do for a man?" Silas paused, his hand hovering over his saddle, his gaze dark and lethal fixed on Cal. The temperature in the street seemed to drop several degrees. "That's none of your business, Cal," he said, his voice low and dangerously calm. Cal, emboldened by a few drinks, scoffed. "Oh, come on, Silas. No need to be so private. A man gets curious when a recluse like you suddenly brings a young woman home. Hope you're treating her right? Or maybe she needs rescuing again?" He winked at his companions, who chuckled nervously. A cold fury simmered beneath Silas's controlled exterior. He had tolerated much in his life, but he would not tolerate slurs against Elara, especially from men who knew nothing of her struggles or his own intentions. His hand dropped not to his saddle, but to the butt of the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was enough. The air crackled with tension. Cal's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. The other men took a collective step back. They knew Silas Blackwood's reputation for being deadly when provoked. "I said," Silas reiterated, his voice a dangerous whisper, "it's none of your business. And I suggest you keep Elara's name out of your mouth, unless you want to find yourself missing a few teeth, or worse." His gaze held Cal's, an unwavering promise of violence if his words were ignored. Cal, suddenly sobered, swallowed hard. All right, Blackwood," he mumbled, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Just asking." Silas continued to stare for a moment longer, ensuring his message was understood. Then slowly, deliberately, he mounted his horse. With a curt nod to no one in particular, he turned the stallion and rode out of Harmony Gulch, leaving behind a stunned silence and a few very shaken men. As he rode back towards the ranch, the anger still simmered within him, but it was tinged with something else, a fierce resolve. He had bought Elara to give her a chance, a refuge from a cruel world. He wouldn't let the malicious tongues of gossips undermine that. He would protect her, not just from physical harm, but from the insidious poison of judgment. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery hues, but in Silas's heart, a new kind of fire had been kindled, a quiet, unyielding determination to safeguard the fragile hope he had unknowingly brought to Blackwood Ranch. The whispers of the town had only strengthened his resolve, drawing him closer to the broken woman whose gentle touch was slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to heal his wounded heart. Silas Blackwood arrived back at the ranch as the last streaks of twilight painted the western sky in fading oranges and deep purples. He dismounted, unsaddled his horse, and meticulously put away his gear, his movements precise and unhurried. The anger he had felt in town still lingered, a low thrum beneath his skin, but the familiar routine of the ranch began to soothe its sharper edges. As he walked towards the main house, he saw Elara sitting on the porch swing, her silhouette framed against the darkening sky. She was looking out at the vast expanse of the land, her figure small and thoughtful. The sight of her, quiet and contemplative, eased some of the tension in his shoulders. He approached her, his footsteps soft on the wooden porch. Elara turned her head, a small startle in her movements, then offered him a faint smile. "Welcome back, sir." "Evening, Elara," he replied, his voice a little gruffer than usual, still carrying the residue of the day's frustrations. He hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the edge of the porch, a few feet from her. The silence that settled between them was not awkward but comfortable, filled with the sounds of the evening, the chirping of crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of the wind through the tall grasses. They watched the last vestiges of the sunset, a shared moment of quiet contemplation. Elara sensed his mood, the underlying tension. "Was everything all right in town, sir?" she asked softly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Silas exhaled slowly, a long, weary breath. He wasn't accustomed to sharing his burdens, but with Elara, he found a strange inclination to do so. "People talk," he stated, his voice flat. "They always do, especially about things they don't understand." Elara nodded, a knowing sadness in her eyes. "I know. About me?" He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. "And about me," he corrected, his gaze unwavering. "They tried to make it out like I bought you for some nefarious purpose. Said I was a recluse who had to buy company." A sardonic twist touched his lips. "And they wondered what kind of life you'd have with a man like me." Elara's heart ached for him. She had imagined the gossip, but hearing it confirmed, seeing the effect it had on him, was different. "I'm sorry, sir," she murmured. "I didn't mean to cause you trouble." Silas shook his head. "You didn't cause anything, Elara. People cause trouble. Their own small minds. Their own envy." He paused, then looked directly at her. "I made it clear to them. You are under my protection here, and no one has the right to speak ill of you, or question your place." His voice was firm, resolute, a quiet promise. Elara felt a sudden rush of warmth spread through her chest. His words, spoken with such conviction, were a shield against the world's harsh judgments. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the stoic ranchero, but a man of honor, a protector. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice thick with emotion. It was the first time she had called him by his given name without the formal "sir," and it felt natural, a small yet significant step. He met her gaze, a subtle softening in his dark eyes. The shared sunset, the quiet confession, the unshakable promise. It created a profound intimacy, not of romance but of shared trust and mutual respect. "What they don't understand," Silas continued, his voice lower now, almost reflective, "is that some things, some people, are worth fighting for, worth protecting." He paused, then added, "You've brought something to this place, Elara, something that was missing." His words took her by surprise. She, a broken woman, a burden in her own eyes, had brought something missing. She looked around the vast, silent ranch, then back at him. "What was missing, Silas?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He gazed out at the darkening landscape, his expression distant, thoughtful. "Light," he finally said. "Hope. A gentleness that had been stamped out of this place for too long, since Sarah." The mention of Sarah's name was not a shadow between them now, but a bridge. He was acknowledging his past, his grief, and somehow connecting it to her presence. Elara's heart swelled with a mixture of sadness and a fragile, burgeoning hope. She realized then that his act of buying her was not merely a transaction of charity, but an unconscious plea for healing, a desperate attempt to bring warmth back into a life consumed by cold desolation. I didn't know," Elara began, her voice trembling. He turned to her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "You didn't need to know. You just needed to be." He stood up, stretching his tired muscles. "Supper's probably ready. Martha will be wondering where we are." As they walked towards the house, a companionable silence enveloped them. The last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into twilight. Elara felt a profound shift within her. The shame of being bought had lessened, replaced by a deep gratitude and a burgeoning sense of belonging. She was no longer just a broken woman rescued from despair. She was an essential part of this isolated world, a catalyst for change in the life of a man who had long believed himself beyond repair. The shared sunset had marked a turning point, illuminating a path towards a future neither of them could have foreseen, where two wounded souls found solace and perhaps salvation in each other's quiet presence. The days that followed Silas's return from Harmony Gulch solidified the unspoken bond between him and Elara. The ranch settled into a comfortable routine, and Elara, with her quiet diligence and growing resilience, became an indispensable part of its rhythm. She often found Silas's gaze lingering on her, a subtle acknowledgement that had replaced his earlier, more detached observation. One afternoon, as Elara was hanging laundry, she saw Silas walking towards her, a small, worn book in his hand. Her heart gave a little flutter. Direct interaction with him, outside of work-related instructions, was still a rare occurrence. "Elara," he began, his voice calm, "I found this in the study. Thought you might like it." He held out the book. It was a collection of poetry, its cover faded but its pages well preserved. Elara took the book, her fingers brushing his. The simple gesture felt significant. Her eyes widened as she read the title, "Poetry. Thank you, Silas." I haven't read anything in so long. Her father had taught her to read and write, but books were a luxury they could never afford. He nodded, a faint, almost shy smile touching his lips. Sarah loved poetry. She had quite a collection. Most of them are packed away, but this one was still out. He paused, then added, "You seem like the kind of woman who would appreciate such things." Elara felt a deep warmth spread through her. His assessment, his understanding of her, was surprisingly astute. It was another glimpse into the man beneath the stoic exterior, a man who saw beyond her circumstances. "I would, very much," she confirmed, clutching the book to her chest. "Good," he said, then turned to walk away. But he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "If there's anything else you need, within reason, just ask Martha, or me." It was an open invitation, a clear departure from his earlier guardedness. Elara watched him go, a profound sense of gratitude filling her. The book was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of trust, of recognition, and of a nascent friendship. It was a tangible connection to his past, a past he was now, however subtly, beginning to share with her. She spent her evenings immersed in the poetry, her mind transported to different worlds, different emotions. The words, so long absent from her life, were a balm to her soul, a reminder of the intellectual curiosity she possessed. Sometimes Silas would sit in his armchair by the fire, reading his own ledgers, and Elara would read her poetry, a comfortable silence flowing between them. He never commented, but she felt his awareness of her, a quiet presence that was both comforting and reassuring. One particularly beautiful evening, Elara was helping Martha prepare dinner. The air was crisp, the scent of wood smoke mingled with the earthy smell of the coming winter. As they worked, Martha, ever observant, spoke softly. "You've bloomed, child," Martha said, her eyes twinkling. "Since you came here, you've got a sparkle in your eyes that wasn't there before." Elara blushed, a shy smile gracing her lips. "I feel different, Martha, safer, and I feel like I have a purpose here." Martha nodded, her smile widening. "You do, Elara. You certainly do." This old ranch needed a woman's touch, a gentle heart. And Silas, well, Silas needed you, though he'd never admit it. Elara's gaze drifted towards the window, watching the last golden rays of the sun illuminate the distant hills. She thought of Silas, of his quiet acts of kindness, his unexpected vulnerability, his fierce protectiveness. She thought of the shared sunset, the storm, and the book of poetry. A seed of something new, something profound was growing within her. It wasn't love in the romantic sense, not yet, but a deep affection, a profound respect, and a yearning to understand the complex, wounded man who had offered her a refuge. That night, after everyone had retired, Elara found herself unable to sleep. She walked out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket, and looked up at the vast, star-studded sky. The air was cold and clear, and the silence of the ranch was profound. Suddenly she heard the creak of the front door. Silas emerged, a rifle in his hand. He was making his usual rounds, checking on the stock, ensuring the ranch was secure. He stopped when he saw her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. Elara shook her head. "Too many stars, too many thoughts." He walked over and leaned against a porch post, his gaze joining hers in the contemplation of the night sky. "It can be overwhelming, this land," he mused, "but also peaceful." "Yes," Elara agreed, "peaceful." She then looked at him, her voice softer than usual. "Silas, thank you for everything, for giving me a chance." He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers under the soft glow of the moon. "You earned it, Elara. You always had it in you. I just gave you the space to find it." His words, simple and honest, were a revelation. He saw her strength, her potential, even when she herself had not. It was a powerful validation, a recognition of her inherent worth. "And you, Silas," she said, a quiet determination in her voice. "You're not as broken as you think you are." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then a slow, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't the joyful smile of the man in the photograph, but it was a genuine smile, a hint of something thawing within him. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe not." They stood there for a long time, side by side, under the watchful gaze of a million stars. The broken woman finding strength and purpose, the wounded man slowly beginning to heal. A seed of growth, nurtured by kindness and shared understanding, had taken root in the arid landscape of Blackwood Ranch, promising a future far richer and more profound than either of them could have ever imagined. The gentle touch of a broken woman was indeed, slowly but surely, healing his wounded heart. The air at Blackwood Ranch took on a crisp, autumnal chill. The golden light of fall cast long shadows across the fields, signaling a new demanding phase of the ranch's yearly cycle, the hay harvest. It was a time of backbreaking work, where every hand, including Elara's, was needed. The days were long, from pre-dawn to well after sunset, and the rhythm of the work was relentless. Elara and Martha were in charge of keeping the men fed and watered. Elara spent her days preparing large meals in the sweltering heat of the kitchen, the scent of fresh bread and hearty stews filling the air. She would then load the food onto a cart, along with large jugs of water and strong coffee, and drive it out to the fields where the men were toiling. The work was grueling. The sun, though no longer at its summer peak, still beat down with a wearying heat. The hay chaff clung to everything, making their skin itch and their throats dry. But Elara found a strange kind of satisfaction in the labor. It was honest work, and she was a part of something larger than herself. She saw the men, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, working in unison, their bodies moving with a practiced, almost balletic efficiency. Silas Blackwood was a tireless presence in the fields. He worked harder than any of his men, his powerful frame moving with a quiet, unyielding strength. He drove the wagons, stacked the bales, and oversaw every detail. He would often ride up to Elara's cart, his face grimy but his eyes clear and focused. One afternoon, as Elara was serving him a plate of sandwiches, she noticed a deep gash on his forearm, a fresh wound from a scythe blade. She gasped, "Silas, you're hurt." He glanced at the wound, as if noticing it for the first time. "It's nothing, just a scratch." "It's not nothing," she insisted, her voice firm. "It needs to be cleaned and bound." Without waiting for his protest, she grabbed a clean piece of cloth from her basket and a canteen of water. "Sit down." Silas, surprised by her command, hesitated for a moment, then, to her astonishment, he complied. He sat on the tailgate of the cart, his large body seeming to shrink slightly under her focused attention. Elara gently washed the cut, her touch surprisingly light. He winced slightly at the sting of the water, but otherwise remained still, his gaze fixed on her face. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her hands steady and gentle. As she wrapped the wound with the cloth, she felt the warmth of his skin against her fingertips, the powerful muscles beneath. The moment was charged with an intimacy that transcended their usual dynamic. It was a moment of care, of trust. "There," she said, tying the bandage with a neat knot. "It's not much, but it'll do, until we can get it properly tended to." "Thank you, Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have a gentle touch." Elara met his gaze, and a soft, genuine smile bloomed on her face. "It's the least I can do." He returned her smile, a rare, breathtaking sight that crinkled the corners of his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. "You've proven to be more than just a pair of hands around here." Her heart fluttered. His words, his smile, were a greater reward than any payment. She was no longer just a worker. She was a caretaker, a partner in the demanding work of the harvest. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery colors, Elara and Silas were left alone in the field, loading the last bales of hay onto a wagon. The men had already returned to the ranch for the evening meal. The air was cool and filled with the scent of cut grass. Silas hoisted a particularly heavy bale onto the wagon with an effortless grunt. "We're almost done," he said. "It's a good harvest this year," Elara observed. "You should be proud." "It's not just my harvest," he replied, turning to look at her. It's everyone's. Yours too. Elara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. She had a place, a purpose. She was no longer a broken woman on an auction block, but a valuable part of this community. As they walked back to the ranch in the fading light, the silence between them was comfortable and full. The moon was a sliver in the sky, and the stars were beginning to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the distance, the mournful, drawn-out howl of a wolf. Elara shivered involuntarily. The wildness of the land, though beautiful, could still be terrifying. Silas noticed her reaction. Without a word, he took a step closer, his large frame shielding her from the night. His presence was a solid, comforting wall between her and the vast, untamed wilderness. He didn't say anything, but the message was clear. She was safe. Elara leaned into his side, her head just reaching his shoulder. He did not pull away. The scent of hay, sweat, and wood smoke was strong on him, the scent of an honest day's work. She felt a profound sense of peace. The man who had bought her was now her protector, her silent companion, and in some quiet, undeniable way, the source of a happiness she had long thought lost. The harvest was more than just a collection of crops. It was a testament to their shared labor, a symbol of the new life that was slowly, patiently beginning to grow. The hay harvest was successfully completed, and a well-deserved rest settled over Blackwood Ranch. The crisp air turned colder, and soon the first flurries of snow began to fall, blanketing the land in a pristine white sheet. The ranch became a world of its own, isolated from the outside by the bitter cold and the deep drifts of snow. Life within the ranch house became a cozy, insular existence. Elara spent her days by the fire, mending clothes, reading her book of poetry, and assisting Martha with the endless preparations for the long winter. She learned to make hearty bread and preserves, her hands growing more skilled with each passing week. The rhythm of her life was simple, but it was a rhythm of peace and security she had never known. Silas, too, seemed to find a kind of peace in the winter's quiet. With the outdoor work limited, he spent more time in the house, in his study, or simply sitting by the fire. He was still a man of few words, but the silence between him and Elara was no longer one of distance, but of quiet companionship. He would often watch her as she worked or read, a thoughtful expression on his face. One evening, Elara was patching one of Silas's worn shirts. A loose thread pulled, and she pricked her finger with the needle. A small drop of blood beaded on her skin. Silas, who had been reading in his chair, looked up at her slight gasp. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes, just a prick," she replied, bringing her finger to her mouth to suck the blood away. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate. He came and sat on the edge of the hearth, a few feet from her. "Let me see." Elara hesitated, but then, trusting him, she offered her hand. He took it gently in his large, calloused one. The contrast was stark, her small, delicate hand in his powerful, weathered grip. He looked at the tiny wound for a moment. Then, with an expert touch, he took a piece of clean cloth from his pocket and wrapped it around her finger. "That'll do for now," he said, his gaze fixed on her face. "You should be more careful." The words were a gentle reprimand, but his tone was filled with concern. Elara looked into his eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw not just concern, but something more profound. She saw the same quiet sorrow she had glimpsed before, but now it was tempered by a new kind of light, a fragile hope. The winter's isolation, however, brought its own challenges. The supplies they had stocked up were dwindling faster than anticipated, especially the medicines. One of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Jimmy, came down with a bad case of the winter fever. His condition worsened quickly, and the medicine they had on hand was running out. Silas was grim-faced as he looked at the boy, who was burning with fever and delirious. "We need to get him to a doctor," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Martha wrung her hands. "Silas, you can't. The roads are impassable. The snow is too deep." "I have to try," he stated, his resolve ironclad. "I can't just let him die." Elara, standing in the doorway, felt a knot of dread in her stomach. A trip through the deep snow would be treacherous. She remembered the dust storm, the fear, and Silas's hand in hers. She knew she couldn't let him go alone. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Silas turned, his expression one of surprise. "Elara, no. I told you, it's too dangerous." "And I told you before, I can help," she insisted. "I can help with the boy. I know a little about poultices and herbs. My mother taught me. And if you get hurt, I'm not a man, but I can still help. I'm not afraid." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same quiet courage he had seen during the storm. He knew she would not be deterred. He saw the same fierce protectiveness in her that he felt for her. With a deep sigh of resignation, he finally nodded. "All right, but you ride with me and you stay close no matter what." The journey was a brutal ordeal. The snow was a thick, unforgiving blanket, and the wind bit at their faces, turning their skin raw. Silas led the way on his strongest horse, with Elara mounted behind him, clinging to him for warmth and security. She held a small bag of her mother's herbs and a few blankets for the boy, who lay wrapped tightly in his own blankets, groaning softly in his feverish state. They fought their way through the drifts, the horses' hooves crunching through the icy crust. The cold seeped into their bones, and the silence of the snow-covered landscape was a stark and eerie contrast to the furious wind. After hours of relentless travel, they finally made it to the next settlement, a small cluster of cabins and a lone doctor's office. Silas, half frozen and exhausted, managed to get the boy inside, where a kind, elderly doctor immediately took over. Elara, her own body trembling with cold, sat by the boy's side, her hand on his forehead, offering comfort and a steady presence while the doctor worked. Silas stood in the doorway watching her, his heart filled with a profound and complicated emotion. He had gone to save a boy, but in doing so, he had witnessed the strength of the woman he had rescued. She was not fragile. She was a force of quiet strength, a gentle hand in a harsh world. When the doctor announced that the boy would be fine, Elara let out a shaky breath of relief. She looked at Silas, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and he offered her a tired, genuine smile. They had faced the winter's challenge, and together they had overcome it. As they prepared to ride back to the ranch, Elara felt a deeper connection to him than ever before. She was not just under his protection. She was his equal, his partner in the trials of the land. The winter journey to save the boy had cemented an unshakable bond between Silas and Elara. Back at the ranch, their interactions changed. The quiet companionship evolved into a deeper, more profound trust. He began to confide in her in small ways, asking for her opinion on certain ranch matters, or telling her stories of his past, things he had never shared with anyone. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Silas spoke of his father, a stern, unyielding man who had built the ranch from a single claim. "He taught me everything I know about this land," Silas said, his voice distant. "But he never taught me how to be a man outside of it, only how to be a fortress." Elara listened, her heart aching for the young boy he once was, who had to build walls to survive. "Maybe you don't need to be a fortress anymore, Silas," she said softly. "Maybe you can just be a home." He looked at her, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He had been so used to being strong, so used to being alone. Her words resonated deeply. She saw the man, not the legend. The ranch hands, too, noticed the change. They saw the quiet understanding between their boss and Elara. They saw how Silas's stern expression softened in her presence, how his rare smiles were reserved for her. They no longer whispered about her presence, but accepted her as a vital part of the ranch's fabric. Her kindness, her quiet strength, and her unwavering loyalty had won their respect. The boy Jimmy had recovered, and his gratitude towards Elara was profound. "You saved me, Elara," he would say, his eyes filled with adoration. "You and Mr. Blackwood." "We did it together," she would reply, always including Silas in the credit. This shared experience, this quiet heroism, had created a sense of purpose for Elara. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a contributor, a healer. She found a profound satisfaction in her work, in the small acts of kindness she could offer to the men who toiled on the ranch. One day, Silas came across Elara in the barn, gently tending to a newborn calf whose mother had died during a difficult birth. Elara was holding a bottle, coaxing the tiny creature to drink. Her face was serene, filled with a maternal love and care that moved him deeply. He stood in the shadows, watching her. He saw her tenderness, her empathy, the deep well of compassion that she possessed. He saw how she had been broken, and yet she still had so much love to give. It was a stark contrast to his own heart, which he had hardened so long ago to avoid feeling the pain of loss. He stepped into the light and Elara looked up, a soft smile on her face. "He's going to be just fine," she said, her voice filled with pride. "He's a little fighter." Silas walked over, his gaze on the calf. "What did you name him?" "Hope," Elara said simply. Silas's eyes met hers. "Hope." He repeated the name, tasting it on his tongue. It was a word he had long banished from his vocabulary. But looking at her, holding the fragile life of the calf in her hands, he felt a flicker of that same feeling in his own chest. He reached out a large, calloused hand and gently touched the calf's head. The small creature nuzzled into his palm. Silas's eyes, usually so dark and unreadable, held a glimmer of something new, something that looked like hope. He looked at Elara, and for the first time, he saw a future not of a fortress, but of a home. A future not of a broken man, but of a man who was finally beginning to heal. Her gentle touch was not just healing his wounded heart, but his wounded spirit too. He had built walls to protect himself from the pain of loss, but in doing so, he had also sealed himself off from the possibility of new beginnings. Elara, with her quiet strength and unwavering compassion, was slowly, patiently, helping him tear down those walls, brick by painful brick. The winter thaw brought with it a sense of renewal at Blackwood Ranch. The days grew longer, the snow began to melt, and the land, long dormant, began to show the first signs of green. Elara felt a renewed sense of energy and purpose. The bond between her and Silas had deepened into a quiet, profound understanding, a connection forged in a shared landscape of sorrow and resilience. But the thawing of the land also meant the return of visitors. The roads once impassable were now open, and the outside world, with all its complexities and dangers, began to creep back into their isolated sanctuary. One crisp spring morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, a single figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Silas, who was in the corral mending a fence, straightened, his body tense. He recognized the horse. It belonged to Jebediah Thorne, the man who had auctioned Elara. A cold dread settled over him. Thorne rode in with his usual air of self-importance, his beady eyes scanning the ranch, his sneer in place. He dismounted, dusting off his coat, and walked towards Silas with an ingratiating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Silas Blackwood," Thorne said, extending a hand. "Heard you had a hard winter. Heard a few things about your new acquisition." Silas ignored the outstretched hand. His gaze was cold, unyielding. "What do you want, Thorne?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Thorne's smile faltered. He cleared his throat. "Just passing through, heard some talk in the saloon. Seems a few folks are curious about the girl you bought, the one who belonged to Elias Vance. Seems some of his kin are looking for her, you see. They're saying they have a right to her." A surge of white-hot anger shot through Silas. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he growled. "Not anymore. She's free. She's her own woman." Thorne chuckled, a greasy sound. "Now, Silas, we both know that's not how it works. The bill of sale says otherwise. Besides, her father's debt, well, that's not settled, is it? It's just been transferred to you, and with it, the rights to her." Silas took a step forward, his fists clenching. He was a man of immense strength, and the look in his eyes was a clear warning. "You listen to me, Thorne. That bill of sale is worthless. You have no claim on her. And if I hear of anyone, especially anyone in your employ, coming within 100 miles of my ranch, you'll regret it." Thorne's smile vanished completely. "Is that a threat, Blackwood?" "It's a promise," Silas said, his voice as hard as stone. "Now get on your horse and get out of here, and don't you ever come back." Thorne, recognizing the sincerity of the threat, held his ground for a moment. Then, with a sneer of pure malice, he turned and walked back to his horse. "We'll see about that, Blackwood," he muttered, loud enough for Silas to hear. "There's more than one way to get what's owed." As Thorne rode away, Silas stood in the corral, his heart pounding with fury. He had thought he had left the past behind in Redemption Creek, but it had followed them. He knew Thorne was a snake, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He also knew the risk of having a legal document, a bill of sale, hanging over their heads. He looked towards the main house where Elara was standing on the porch watching them. Her face was a mask of concern. She had overheard their conversation. He knew he had to tell her the truth, the whole truth, about the dangers that still lurked. He walked to her, his movements stiff. "Elara," he began, his voice low. "That was Jebediah Thorne, The man who sold you. He says there are people looking for you. Family. Who claim they have a right to you. Elara's face paled. My father's family, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't have any family, not since my father. I don't know who they are, Silas said, his jaw tight, but I know they're working with Thorn. He wants something. He always does. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. But listen to me. No one is going to take you from this ranch, not as long as I'm here. You are safe. Elara looked into his eyes, and she saw the fierce, unyielding resolve he had shown in the face of the town's gossips and the storm. He was her protector, her shield against the shadows of her past. She believed him. She had to. In this wild, uncertain world, his promise was her only sanctuary. The return of a shadow from her past had not broken her, but had instead strengthened the fragile bond of trust between her and the man who had bought her. The visit from Jebediah Thorn left a lingering unease at Blackwood Ranch. The threat, though subtle, was clear. Silas, ever vigilant, increased his security measures, riding the perimeter of his property more frequently and instructing his men to be on high alert for any unfamiliar riders. Elara, too, felt the weight of Thorn's visit. The memories of the auction block, of her father's despair, came rushing back with a fresh, raw clarity. She was no longer just a woman who had been rescued. She was a woman whose past was a live wire, and it was now threatening to electrify her new life. One evening, as she was helping Silas with the accounts in his study, her hand trembled as she held a pen. Silas noticed. You're worried, he stated, his voice a quiet observation. I am, she admitted, her voice low. I don't understand. Why would my family, if I have any, suddenly be looking for me? Silas closed the ledger he was working on, his expression grim. Thorn is a liar, Elara. He's a scavenger. He's not interested in your well-being or your family's. He's interested in what he can get from me. He knows I value you, and he sees an opportunity to exploit that. Elara's heart pounded. He thinks you will pay him for me? She whispered, a new kind of humiliation washing over her. Silas's eyes met hers, and for a rare moment, a flash of pure, unadulterated anger crossed his face. If he thinks I'm going to pay him a single dime to keep him away from my ranch, he is a fool. You are not a possession, Elara. You are not for sale. Not again. Not ever. His words, spoken with such conviction, were a balm to her wounded spirit. He saw her as a person, not a commodity. He was fighting for her freedom, for her dignity, and for her right to belong. The next few weeks were a time of tense waiting. The ranch, once a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. The men were quiet, their movements deliberate. The air was thick with the threat of an unseen storm. One afternoon, as Elara was mending a blanket on the porch, she saw a rider approaching from a different direction than the main road. He was not a familiar ranch hand. He was a young man, his face gaunt, his clothes threadbare. He looked exhausted, as if he had been riding for a long time. Silas, who was in the corral, saw him too. He immediately walked towards the rider, his hand resting on his revolver. The young man dismounted, his legs wobbly. He looked at Silas, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. Are you Silas Blackwood? He asked, his voice raspy. I am, Silas replied, his voice a low growl. Who are you? My name is Caleb Vance, the young man said, a hand on his chest. I'm Elara's cousin, her father's brother's son. I was sent to find her. A cold, hard knot formed in Silas's stomach. The snake, Thorn, was a man of his word. He had sent someone, but this young man, he didn't look like a threat. He looked more like a victim. Why are you here? Silas asked, his voice still guarded. They told me that she was being held captive, Caleb said, his eyes filled with confusion and fear as he looked around the peaceful, well-kept ranch. They said you were a heartless man. They paid me to find her and tell her to come home. They said her father's family needed her. Silas's gaze hardened. Thorn's lie, his manipulation, was sickeningly clear. He was using this poor, desperate boy as a pawn. Elara, who had been listening from the porch, walked forward, her heart pounding. Caleb, she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and recognition. She remembered him from a long time ago, a small boy on her father's brother's farm. Caleb's eyes widened as he saw her. Elara, it's really you. They said you were a prisoner. They said you were in danger. I'm not a prisoner, Caleb, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I'm not in danger. I'm safe here. Silas, he rescued me." Caleb looked at Silas, then back at Elara, a profound sense of confusion on his face. He had been lied to. He had been used. Silas, seeing the boy's genuine distress, took a step back, his hand leaving the butt of his revolver. "He was working for Thorn," Silas said, his voice flat. "He's a fool, and he was lied to, but he's not a threat." He looked at Elara, a question in his eyes. Elara nodded. "He's not. He's just a victim." She walked to Caleb, her heart filled with pity for him. "Who sent you, Caleb?" "Uncle Jedediah," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "He told us you were being held against your will, that Mr. Blackwood was a villain. He said he would pay a reward for your return." Elara's face was a mask of cold fury. Thorn had not only profited from her father's death, he was now using her supposed family to try and get more. "You're a long way from home, boy," Silas said, his voice a little softer now, all anger gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "Come inside. We'll get you something to eat and a place to rest. Then you can tell us everything. And you can tell your Uncle Jedediah that Elara is not coming home. She is home." Caleb, exhausted and defeated, nodded, his shoulders slumping in relief. The storm, it seemed, was growing, but now they had a new piece of the puzzle. Thorn's motive was clear, and his deceit was exposed. The growing storm had a name and a face, and they were no longer facing it alone. They were a united front, ready to face whatever came together. Caleb Vance, exhausted and confused, was given a hot meal and a warm bed. Elara and Silas listened patiently as he recounted his story. The family that was looking for her was a distant cousin, a man who had also been manipulated by Jedediah Thorn. They believed Thorn's lies about Silas holding her captive and saw the reward he offered as a way to ease their own desperate financial situation. The young man was clearly a pawn in Thorn's game. He was not malicious, only naive and desperate. He had no idea about the bill of sale or the true nature of Thorn's dealings. "He told us Mr. Blackwood was a monster," Caleb said, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "He said you were a recluse, a cold man who would do anything to get what he wanted. He said you'd sold your soul to the devil to get this land." Silas simply listened, his face a mask of stone. He had heard worse rumors about himself, but this one, this lie that was so deliberately crafted to paint him as a villain and to manipulate a young innocent man, filled him with a cold fury. Elara, however, saw the truth. "He's a liar, Caleb," she said softly. "A master manipulator. He would have used you and then thrown you away." She looked at Silas. "He already did." Silas nodded, his gaze on the young man. "You were just a delivery boy, Caleb. A message. He wanted me to know he hadn't given up." "What do I do now?" Caleb asked, his voice filled with despair. "I can't go back. He'll know I failed." "You can stay here," Silas said, surprising even himself. "For a while. You can earn your keep. Then when the time is right, you'll go, but you won't go alone. You'll go with a message of your own." Caleb's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I'll do anything you ask." Over the next few days, Caleb became an unlikely ally. He worked alongside the other ranch hands, learning the ropes, his naivete slowly replaced by a sense of purpose. He told Elara more about her distant family, about their struggles, their hopes. He had a letter from them, which he had been too afraid to deliver. It was a plea, a desperate request for her to come home, to help them. It was filled with Thorn's lies, but the underlying tone was one of genuine desperation. Elara read the letter, her heart heavy with a mixture of sadness and anger. Her family, her kin, had been twisted against her by a greedy man. She knew she couldn't go back, not to a life of debt and desperation, but she also knew she couldn't abandon them. She took the letter to Silas. "They're not bad people, Silas, they're just desperate, and they were lied to." Silas read the letter, his face grim. "They're pawns, Elara, just like Caleb, Thorns using their desperation against them." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "What do you want to do?" "I want to help them," she said, her voice firm. "I don't know how, but I want to help them. And I want Thorn to know that his lies will not work, that he can't have me or them." Silas nodded, a slow, thoughtful gesture. "Then we'll find a way." He knew that the fight was no longer just about Elara's freedom or his own reputation. It was about justice. It was about protecting the innocent from a man who preyed on their weaknesses. It was about proving that kindness and decency could win out against greed and malice. The next morning, Silas instructed Caleb to write a letter that would be delivered not to Thorn, but to Elara's family. In it, Elara wrote in her own hand a letter filled with love and reassurance. She told them that she was safe, that she was happy, that Silas Blackwood was a good man, not a monster. She told them about Thorn's deceit. She promised them that she would find a way to help them, but that she could not return home. Caleb, now fully understanding the truth, promised to deliver the letter and to tell her family the truth. He was no longer just a delivery boy. He was a messenger of hope, a beacon of truth in a sea of lies. He had found a purpose and an unlikely ally in the man he had been told was a villain. Silas, in turn, began to formulate a plan. He knew that the only way to truly stop Thorn was to strike at his core, his reputation, his business. He was a man who lived by the ledger, who valued money above all else. He would not be able to stand a blow to his pride and his pocketbook. The unlikely alliance between Elara, Silas, and Caleb was a new weapon in their arsenal. It was a weapon of truth, of kindness, and of a shared purpose. They were no longer just a man and a woman in an isolated ranch. They were a fortress of their own, built not of stone but of loyalty and love. The growing storm was still on the horizon, but now they were prepared to face it, together. Silas's plan was meticulously crafted. He had spent his life outsmarting men like Jebediah Thorn, men who believed that the world was a chessboard and people were mere pawns. He knew that to beat Thorn, he had to play a game Thorn didn't understand, a game of truth and honor. He sent Caleb back to Redemption Creek with Elara's letter to her family, along with a new one of his own. The letter, sealed with his personal signet ring, was addressed to Thorn. It was a formal-looking document, the kind that would raise no suspicion from Thorn's men, but inside it was a carefully worded challenge. Silas's letter to Thorn was short and to the point. It was an offer to settle their outstanding business once and for all. He offered to meet Thorn at a neutral location, the general store in Harmony Gulch, in 1 week's time. He promised to bring a large sum of money to settle what was owed. The words were chosen carefully, a calculated ambiguity that would make Thorn's greed get the better of his caution. When Caleb returned to Redemption Creek, he delivered Elara's letter to her family and Silas's to Thorn. Thorn, his eyes gleaming with greed, read the letter, a smug smile on his face. "So the big man's finally going to pay," he said to his men, a look of triumph in his eyes. He didn't question the sudden change of heart. He just saw the opportunity to get what he wanted. He didn't know Silas Blackwood. He didn't know that the business Silas was referring to wasn't a financial transaction. It was a moral one. Back at the ranch, the tension was palpable. Elara worried about Silas, about his plan. She had come to care for him deeply, and the thought of him putting himself in danger for her sake filled her with fear. "What if he doesn't come alone, Silas?" she asked one evening, her voice filled with concern. "What if he brings men with him?" "He will," Silas said, his voice calm. "He's a coward. He won't face me alone, but I'm not going to be alone either." He looked at his foreman, a gruff, loyal man named Ben. "Ben and a few of the others will be there, hidden, just in case." Elara still felt a knot of worry in her stomach. "Be careful, please," she pleaded, her eyes filled with tears. Silas reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "I will, Elara. I have too much to come back to now." His words, spoken with a quiet sincerity, were a profound admission. He had a reason to live, a reason to fight. He had her. The week passed slowly, each day a new step towards the inevitable confrontation. Elara spent her time helping Martha, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind replayed every possible scenario. She knew that this was more than just a fight for her freedom. It was a battle for Silas's soul, a fight to prove that the kind, wounded man beneath the tough exterior was the real him, the man who was capable of great things. The day of the meeting arrived. The sun was high in the sky, and Harmony Gulch was bustling with life. Silas rode into town, his face a mask of stone, his every movement a testament to his quiet strength. He dismounted in front of the general store, his eyes scanning the street. He saw Thorn's men, a rough-looking lot loitering in the saloon, their eyes on him. He felt the tension, the silent threat. He walked into the general store, where Thorn was waiting, a smug smile on his face. "Silas," he said, "I see you've come to your senses." Silas didn't reply. He walked to the counter, took a leather pouch from his coat and placed it on the counter. "The money you're owed," he said, his voice low. Thorne's eyes gleamed as he reached for the pouch. "I knew you were a man of your word, Blackwood. Now where's the girl?" "She's not here," Silas said, a cold, hard glint in his eyes. "And she won't be. This money isn't for you, Thorne. It's for Elara's family. For the debt her father owed. The debt you profited from." Thorne's smile vanished. "What?" he sputtered. "You can't do that. The bill of sale. It's mine. She's my property." "She's not property, Thorne," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "She's a woman. A free woman. You sold her, but you can't buy her. And you can't have her." Thorne's face turned a mottled red with fury. "This is a trick. You're trying to cheat me." "I'm not cheating you, Thorne," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm fighting you. I'm fighting for Elara's dignity. And I'm fighting for the soul of this land. You can take this money and you can use it to get her family out of debt. Or you can leave with nothing. But either way, she is not yours. She is free." Thorne, caught in the trap of his own greed, was faced with a choice. He could fight Silas, a fight he knew he would lose, or he could take the money and leave, his pride wounded, but his pockets full. For a moment, his eyes flickered to the door, to his men, a silent signal of a coming fight. But then he saw the look in Silas's eyes, a promise of a reckoning that would be more painful than any loss of money. He knew he was beaten. He was outmatched, not by strength but by a quiet, unwavering moral authority he didn't possess. With a snarl of defeat, he snatched the pouch from the counter. "You win this round, Blackwood," he hissed. "But it's not over." "It is," Silas said, his voice flat. "As far as you and I are concerned, it is. If I ever see you near my ranch again, you'll regret the day you were born." Thorne, his face a mask of furious humiliation, stalked out of the store, his men following him, their heads held low in defeat. Silas watched them go, a grim satisfaction in his heart. The trap had worked. The man had been humiliated and defeated, not by violence but by honor. The shadow of Elara's past was finally decisively gone. Silas returned to the ranch with a sense of quiet triumph. The confrontation with Thorne had been a success, a clean break from the past that had haunted them for so long. As he rode in, he saw Elara standing on the porch, her face a mask of worry. The moment she saw him, safe and sound, her shoulders slumped in a wave of relief. She ran to him, a rare display of public affection, and threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. Silas, surprised but not unwelcoming, wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. He could feel her heart pounding, a frantic drum against his chest. He stroked her hair gently, his own heart filled with a profound sense of peace. The battle was over. The victory was theirs. "It's done, Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He's gone. He's not coming back." Elara pulled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, Silas. Thank you." Her gratitude was a powerful, moving thing. It was not just for her freedom, but for her dignity, for her right to a new life. He had fought not for himself, but for her, and in doing so, he had healed a part of himself he had long thought lost. The next few days were a celebration of sorts. The men, who had been on edge for weeks, were now relaxed, their faces filled with relief. The ranch returned to its peaceful, orderly rhythm. But for Elara, the victory, though sweet, also brought with it a new kind of challenge, the weight of freedom. She was no longer just a woman who had been rescued. She was a free woman with her own choices, her own future. The chains of her past were gone, but the long, dusty road of her future was now open before her, and for a woman who had spent so long simply surviving, the choices felt overwhelming. One evening, Silas found her in her room. A map of the territory spread out on her bed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up, a troubled expression on her face. "I'm trying to decide what to do, now that I can." She gestured to the map. "I could go west, to California, or I could go back east. Maybe find work in a city. I don't know, Silas. I don't know what I want." Silas walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the map, at the endless possibilities spread out before her. He knew this was a moment of profound importance for her. She had been living in a state of quiet acceptance for so long, simply following the path that had been laid out for her. Now, for the first time in her life, she had to choose her own path. "You don't have to decide all at once, Elara," he said, his voice gentle. "You have time. This is your home now. You can take all the time you need. She looked at him, a flicker of pain in her eyes. But, is it? Is it my home? Or is it just a temporary refuge? A place I'm staying until I can find my own way? His heart ached. He had so carefully built this sanctuary for her, this fortress of peace. But he had not considered that for a woman who had been so used to being a temporary object, the idea of a permanent home would be a challenge. "It's your home, Elara," he said, his voice firm, filled with a conviction that came from the very depths of his soul. "For as long as you want it to be. This place, it's better because you're here." "I'm better because you're here. You belong here, you always have." Her eyes filled with tears and she looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "Silas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand. His touch was warm and steady. "I'm not asking you to stay because I bought you. I'm asking you to stay because I want you to, because I'm in love with you." The words, so long held captive behind the walls of his heart, now spilled out, raw and honest. Elara's breath hitched. She had seen his love in his actions, in his quiet care, in his fierce protectiveness. But to hear him say it, to hear the words spoken aloud, was a different kind of magic. Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy, of relief, of a profound and overwhelming love she had not dared to name. She leaned into his touch, her hand coming up to cover his on her cheek. "I love you too, Silas," she whispered, the words a gentle balm on his wounded heart. "I have for a long time." He leaned in and gently, with a reverence born of a man who has found a treasure he never thought he'd see, he kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss, but a kiss of two weary souls, finally finding their way home. It was a kiss of promise, of hope, of a future filled with love and healing. The weight of her freedom was no longer a burden, but a blessing. She was free to choose, and she had chosen. She had chosen to stay. The kiss was the beginning of everything. It was a silent promise, a quiet declaration of a love that had been growing in the shadows for months. The fortress around Silas's heart, a fortress he had built with such care and precision, had finally crumbled. It was not a swift, violent collapse, but a gentle, graceful dissolution brought on by the steady, unwavering love of a woman who had found her own strength. The days that followed were filled with a quiet joy. The ranch, once a place of survival, was now a home. Silas and Elara spent their time together, their hands finding each other naturally, their gazes lingering a moment longer than they used to. They were still the same people, the stoic ranchero and the quiet, resilient woman, but now a new kind of light shone in their eyes. The men at the ranch, ever observant, noticed the change. They saw the way Silas's face would light up when Elara walked into a room. They saw the quiet, comfortable affection between them. They were happy for their boss, a man who had been alone for so long. They had witnessed his grief, his solitude, and they had seen how Elara, with her gentle touch, had brought him back to life. Elara's life was now filled with a new purpose. She was no longer just a woman who worked on the ranch. She was the woman who loved its owner and who was loved in return. She helped Martha with her duties, but she also spent time with Silas, helping him with his ledgers, riding with him to check on the cattle, and sharing his quiet moments by the fire. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the stars, Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad you found me, Silas," she said softly. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "I didn't find you, Elara. You found me. You found a way into a place I thought was sealed off forever." He looked down at her, a profound look of love in his eyes. "You came here a broken woman, but you're not broken anymore. You're whole, and you've made me whole too." Elara lifted her head and looked into his eyes. "You're a good man, Silas Blackwood. A good, kind man, and I'm the luckiest woman in the world." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "No," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "I am." He then leaned in and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that was a promise of a future they would build together, a future of love, of trust, of a home built not on fear, but on a foundation of shared sorrow and a burgeoning hope. The broken woman had indeed, with her gentle touch, healed his wounded heart, and in doing so had found her own path to a new beginning. The journey was not over, but the road ahead was no longer a long, lonely one. It was a road they would walk hand in hand together. The ranch entered a new tender season. The The spring rains were a soft backdrop to the blossoming of Silas and Elara's relationship. They no longer had to hide their feelings. They were an open secret, a quiet testament to love's power to heal. Their hands found each other's naturally. Their gazes lingered, and the silence between them was no longer a void, but a sanctuary filled with a shared understanding. Elara's own heart, long guarded and wounded, was unfurling like a wildflower after a long winter. She found herself laughing more, her voice a melody that brought a new kind of light to the stern, quiet ranch. She would often sit with Silas by the fire, reading poetry, her voice soft and melodious while he worked on his ledgers. He would look up, a faint smile on his face, his eyes filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. One particularly stormy evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Elara was preparing dinner while Silas was in his study. The storm outside was a dramatic display of nature's power, but inside, the house was a haven of warmth and peace. A sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and the lights in the main room flickered. Elara flinched, a flash of fear in her eyes. The raw power of the storm brought back memories of the dust storm, the terror, the feeling of being powerless. She dropped a spoon with a clatter, her hands trembling. Silas, hearing the noise, emerged from his study. He saw her, her face pale, her hands shaking. He walked to her, his movements calm and reassuring. "It's all right, Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's just a little storm." "I know," she whispered, her voice tight with a fear she thought she had conquered. It reminds me." He understood. He remembered her fear during the dust storm, her small, trembling hand in his. He reached out and gently took her hands in his. His touch was warm and steady, an anchor in the midst of her rising panic. "This is not like that," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You're safe. We're safe. You're not alone." He didn't just tell her. He showed her. He led her away from the kitchen towards the fireplace, the heart of the house. He sat down and pulled her onto his lap, her head resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, a protective shield against the raging storm outside. Elara felt the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart beneath her ear, a calm, unwavering pulse that slowly soothed her fear. She felt the strength of his arms around her, a safe harbor in the tempest. She was no longer a terrified, powerless girl in a dust storm. She was a woman, loved and protected, in the arms of a man she trusted completely. He didn't speak, but his presence was a powerful reassurance. He simply held her, letting the storm rage outside, while inside a different kind of gentle storm raged, a storm of emotion and love. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for his protection, but for his understanding, for his ability to see her fear and to meet it with such quiet, unwavering strength. As the storm began to pass, its thunder fading into a distant rumble, Elara looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion she had never seen before. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gentle, tender gesture that spoke volumes. "Always," he said, his voice husky. "Always." In the quiet aftermath of the storm, they sat together, two souls who had been weathered and beaten by life, now finding solace and peace in each other's arms. The gentle storm had passed, but it had left in its wake a new kind of clarity, a new kind of love. It was a love that was not just about grand gestures or romantic words, but about small, quiet acts of comfort and reassurance, about a shared understanding that transcended words. It was a love that had the power to heal, to mend, and to transform. The spring turned into a glorious summer. The ranch hummed with a renewed energy, and the fields, green and lush, promised a bountiful harvest. Elara and Silas's relationship deepened, their love a quiet, steady force that permeated every corner of their lives. They were a team, a partnership, in the work of the ranch and in the unspoken work of their hearts. One evening, Silas came to the main house, his face grim, a letter in his hand. He found Elara in the kitchen preparing dinner. He had been gone all day, riding the fences and checking on the cattle, and she had missed his presence. "What is it, Silas?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Is everything all right?" He looked at her, his expression a mixture of anger and weariness. He held out the letter. "It's from Thorne," he said, his voice a low growl. "He found out I paid off your father's debt with a fake document. The bill of sale is still legally binding." Elara's face paled. But that can't be right. You gave him money. It was a trick, Silas said, his jaw tight. A maneuver to get him to leave us alone. I sent a bag of coins with a letter that said the money owed, but the bill of sale itself, the legal document, is still in his possession. He wants to use it against me. He wants to take you. A cold dread settled over Elara. The ghost of her past, the spectre of the auction block, was back. The victory they had celebrated, the freedom they had felt, had been a temporary illusion. She was still, legally, a commodity, a bargaining chip in a game of power and revenge. He says if I don't give him a significant sum of money and sign over a piece of my land, he will expose me. He'll show the whole territory that I am a man of deceit, and he will use the legal document to take you from me. He wants to humiliate me, and he wants to break me. Elara's heart pounded. She saw the rage and the helplessness in his eyes. He was a man who had always been in control, and now he was facing an enemy who held all the cards. She was his greatest strength, and now she was his greatest weakness. Silas took her hands in his gaze intense. "Elara," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "I will not lose you. I will not let him win." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as if he could shield her from the world with his own body. She leaned into him, her heart aching for the man who was willing to lose everything to keep her. That night, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Silas led Elara to a small private bluff overlooking the valley. It was a place he rarely came, a place he had only shared with Sarah. But now it was a place for a new memory. The sky was a canvas of fiery oranges and soft pinks, a breathtaking spectacle. Elara looked at the beauty of the landscape, at the home they had built together, and she felt a profound sense of love. Silas turned to her, his hands on her shoulders. "Elara," he said, his voice filled with a quiet strength, "I'm going to find a way to stop him. I'm going to fight him with every last ounce of strength in my body. But I want to know something. I need to know something. I need to know that no matter what happens, no matter what he does, you will be my wife. Will you marry me, Elara? Will you be my wife?" Elara's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy and of profound relief. The question, spoken at a time of such great peril, was not a desperate plea but a powerful promise. He was not just asking her to be his wife, but to be his partner, his equal, his sanctuary. "Yes, Silas," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." He let out a long, shaky breath, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss filled with a desperate hope and a powerful promise. The sun dipped below the horizon, and in the twilight a new beginning was born, a love that would stand against the shadows of the past and the threat of a coming storm. The proposal had not been an act of desperation, but a declaration of defiance, a promise that no legal document, no man's greed, could ever break the bond they had forged. The proposal was a beacon of hope in a darkening time. Elara and Silas decided to marry immediately. They knew that a legal document would not change the fact that they were already committed to each other, but it would be a public declaration, a powerful statement against Thorne's greed. They decided on a simple, private ceremony. Martha, with her kind heart, was the only one they confided in. She was overjoyed, her face beaming with happiness. "It's about time," she said, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "You two belong together." They rode into a small remote town called Hope Creek, where they knew a kind older reverend would perform the ceremony without asking too many questions. They wore their finest clothes, simple but clean. Elara wore a modest cream-colored dress and a small wildflower in her hair. Silas wore a clean, dark suit, his usual stoicism replaced by a nervous excitement that made him look younger and more vulnerable. The reverend was a kind, gentle man with a kind smile. He looked at them, a couple so clearly in love, and didn't ask for details. He saw their sincerity, their profound connection. The ceremony was short and sweet. Elara's voice trembled with emotion as she said her vows, her eyes locked on Silas. He too spoke his vows with a raw, honest sincerity that brought tears to her eyes. He promised to love and cherish her, to protect her, to be her home. She promised to be his partner, his sanctuary, his love. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Elara felt a profound sense of peace. She was no longer a broken woman, a commodity, a ghost of her past. She was a wife. She was loved. She was home. Silas, too, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer just a ranchero, a recluse. He was a husband, he had a wife, a family. He had found a treasure he had long thought lost, and he would do anything to protect it. They returned to the ranch, their hearts full, their hands intertwined. The men who were oblivious to their marriage welcomed them back with a cheer. They had been worried about them, worried about the threat of thorn. But now they saw a new kind of light in their eyes, a new kind of hope. The next day Silas rode into town, a new kind of resolve in his eyes. He went to the sheriff's office and filed a new set of papers. Papers that legally declared their marriage, a public record that could be used against Thorn. He wanted to make it clear that Elara was his wife, a person with a legal status, not a commodity to be bought and sold. He then sent a letter to Thorn, his words laced with a quiet defiance. He told him that he had married Elara, and that any attempts to separate them would be met with the full force of the law and his own considerable will. He had drawn a line in the sand, and he was daring Thorn to cross it. When Thorn received the letter, he was furious. He had lost. He had lost the girl. He had lost his leverage, and he had lost the game. His greed had been outsmarted by love, and his malice had been defeated by a quiet, unwavering honor. But Thorn was not a man who took defeat well. His fury was a wild, unpredictable beast. He was a man who had lost everything, and he was now a man with nothing to lose. He knew that his plans of blackmail and revenge were over, but he also knew that he could still hurt Silas. He could still hurt Elara. He could still strike a blow against the man who had defeated him. He was a man who lived by the motto, "If you can't have what you want, you can at least burn it to the ground." He was a shadow, a threat, and a reminder that even when the darkness seems to have been defeated, it can always return with a new, more dangerous kind of malice. The news of the marriage, a quiet, defiant act of love, spread through the territory like wildfire. It was a story that appealed to the frontier's sense of justice and romance. The stoic, reclusive ranchero, who had been wronged by the townsfolk, had found his soulmate in a woman he had saved from a life of servitude. The whispers of gossip and malice were replaced with a quiet respect and a grudging admiration. Jebediah Thorn, however, was not one to be swayed by romance. His fury, once a wild beast, had settled into a cold, calculating rage. He had lost the game, but he had not lost his will to destroy. He knew that the only way to truly hurt Silas was to strike at what he held most dear, the land, the ranch, the home they had built together. One particularly dry, windy night, Elara and Silas were in their bedroom, their hands intertwined, a quiet peace settling over them. They were talking about the future, about their plans for the ranch, for their family. They had found a profound sense of peace in each other's presence, a peace that was a powerful contrast to the chaotic world outside. Suddenly, the ranch hand's shouts erupted, cutting through the night like a knife. Silas's eyes snapped open, his body tense. "Fire!" he heard one of the men shout. "The barns are on fire!" Silas leapt out of bed, grabbing his pants and shirt. He was a man of action, a man of few words, and a man who knew that in the face of a fire, every second counted. He ran out of the house, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and dread. Elara too ran out, her heart in her throat. She saw it then, the fiery orange glow on the horizon, the thick, acrid smoke rising into the night sky. The main barn, the lifeblood of the ranch, was engulfed in flames. The ranch hands, a small, courageous band of brothers, were already there, fighting the fire with everything they had. They were using buckets of water, wet blankets and shovels, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their bodies a blur of frantic motion. But the fire, fueled by the dry wind, was a monster, a raging beast that consumed everything in its path. Silas, with his years of experience, immediately took charge. He directed the men, his voice a calm, authoritative command in the midst of the chaos. "Cut a fire break, get the horses out, get the equipment out." Elara, too, found her purpose. She ran to the water trough, filling buckets and running back to the men, her hands raw and blistered from the effort. She wasn't a warrior, but she was a part of the fight, a vital link in the chain of command. They fought for hours, a desperate, valiant battle against the raging fire. The heat was a living thing, a searing wave that threatened to consume them all. The scent of burnt wood, burnt hay, and scorched earth filled the air. a grim reminder of their loss. As the sun began to rise, a faint, weary grey, the fire began to die down. The barns were a smouldering ruin, a charred skeleton against the morning sky. The horses had been saved, the equipment too for the most part, but the barns, the heart of the ranch, were gone. Silas, his face and clothes caked with soot, his body aching, stood in the smouldering ruins, his heart heavy with grief. He had lost his past, his home, his life's work, but he had not lost his love. He had not lost Elara. She walked to him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't say anything, but simply wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. He leaned into her, his body trembling with exhaustion and sorrow. "It's all gone," he whispered, his voice raw. "No, it's not," she said, her voice firm. "We're not. This is just a place, a barn. It can be rebuilt. We can rebuild it. We have each other." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw her unwavering love, her unshakable strength. He saw a woman who had been through fire and flood and had emerged with her spirit intact. He realized then that he had not lost everything. He had lost a piece of the past, yes, but he had not lost his future. He had not lost his heart. He kissed her, a long, weary kiss that was a promise of a new beginning. They would rebuild. They would heal. They would rise from the ashes of their past. Together, a new kind of family, a new kind of home. The fire had taken their past, but it had not taken their future. It had not taken their love. The morning after the fire was a bleak, somber affair. The ranch, once a vibrant, bustling hub of life, was now a smouldering ruin. The men, exhausted but resolute, began the painful work of cleaning up the debris, their movements slow and heavy. Silas, with Elara by his side, was a man of quiet, unyielding determination. He was a man who had faced loss before, and he would face it again. He was a man who had been through fire and flood, and had emerged with his spirit intact. The news of the fire, like all news in the West, traveled fast. By noon, a small group of townspeople from Harmony Gulch began to arrive. They were not there to gloat, but to offer a helping hand. The story of Elara and Silas, of their love and their fight against Thorn, had reached them, and it had touched their hearts. They brought food, water, and offers of help. The men who had been so suspicious and judgmental before were now filled with a quiet respect. They saw a man who had been wronged, a man who had been betrayed, a man who had lost everything. They saw a man who had loved, and a woman who had stood by him. A small, humble man, a farmer named Thomas, walked to Silas and extended a hand. "Silas," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "I'm sorry. We were wrong about you. We heard the rumors. We believed them. But now, we know the truth. You're a good man, and you're a good friend." Silas, a man not prone to emotion, was moved. He took the man's hand and shook it, a rare show of affection. "Thank you, Thomas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I appreciate it." Elara, too, was touched. The women who had once whispered about her, who had judged her, were now offering her a hand, a kind word, a warm embrace. They had seen her strength, her quiet dignity, and they had recognized a kindred spirit. The town, it seemed, was having a reckoning of its own. The fire, a brutal, violent act, had exposed the darkness of Thorn's malice, and it had also brought out the best in the people who had once been his followers. They were a community, and in the face of a shared tragedy they had found a common purpose. In the midst of the chaos, a lone rider approached the ranch. It was Caleb, Elara's cousin. He had heard about the fire, and he had come as fast as he could. He dismounted, his face grim, and ran to Elara. "Elara," he said, his voice filled with concern, "I heard. Are you all right? Is everyone all right?" "We're all right, Caleb," she said, a sad smile on her face. "We're all safe." Caleb's eyes then fell on Silas. He saw the soot on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes, but he also saw a profound love. He saw a man who had been through hell and had emerged a hero. "Thorn did this," Caleb said, his voice filled with a cold, quiet rage. "I know he did. He's a monster." Silas nodded, his jaw tight. "He did. He's a coward, a man who would rather destroy than build. But we're not like him." Caleb then looked at Elara, and he saw the profound love in her eyes. "Elara," he said, his voice a whisper, "the letter, the one you sent, I gave it to your family. They were so sorry. They were so ashamed. They want to come here, to help. to apologize. Elara's eyes filled with tears. She had been so afraid of her past, so afraid of facing her family. But now she realized they were not a threat. They were a part of her, a part of the past she had been trying to outrun. They were a part of the future she was now building. "I want them to come, Silas," she said, her voice filled with a quiet plea. "I want them to see what a good man you are. I want them to see our home. I want them to be a part of our new beginning." Silas, a man who had so long been a recluse, a man who had so long been alone, was moved. He had so fiercely protected his privacy, his solitude, but now he saw that his life was no longer just his own. It was a life he shared with Elara. It was a life that was open to the world. "Then they'll come," he said, his voice a low, firm promise. "They'll come. We'll rebuild this ranch together, and we'll show them what a home is." The town's reckoning had led to a new kind of community. The fire had taken their barns, but it had also given them a new kind of family. It had given them a new kind of hope. It had given them a new kind of future, a future that was not about a man and a woman, but about a community, a family, a new beginning. The days after the fire were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The townsfolk, true to their word, came in droves to help. Men who had once viewed Silas with suspicion now worked alongside him, their hands calloused, their spirits high. Women who had once whispered about Elara now brought her food and comfort, their faces etched with a genuine kindness. The ranch, once a symbol of Silas's solitude, was now a bustling hub of community, a testament to the power of human compassion. The rhythmic clang of hammers, the sound of saws, and the cheerful laughter of children filled the air. They were rebuilding not just the barns, but the community itself, a bridge of understanding and forgiveness built on a foundation of shared grief and a burgeoning hope. In the midst of the chaos, a stagecoach from the east arrived. From it, a small group of people emerged, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. It was Elara's family, her mother's brother, his wife, and their 2 children. They were a humble, weary-looking group, their clothes worn, their faces etched with the lines of hard work and quiet sorrow. Elara's heart pounded as she saw them. She hadn't seen them in years, not since her father's death. She ran to them, her arms wide. "Auntie Helen! Uncle Thomas!" she cried, her voice filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. They embraced her, holding her tightly, their eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Elara," her aunt said, her voice choked with emotion. "We're so sorry. We were so wrong. We were so foolish to believe that man." "It's all right," Elara said, her voice trembling. "It's not your fault. He lied to you. He used you." Uncle Thomas, a tall, kind man, then walked to Silas. He looked at the man who had been painted as a monster, and he saw a man of quiet dignity, a man who was covered in soot, but whose eyes were filled with an unshakable love. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, extending a hand, "I don't know what to say. We were so wrong about you. We owe you a great debt." Silas took his hand, a firm, warm handshake. "No debt," he said, his voice low, "just an apology for a foolish man's lies." The family was taken in, fed, and given a place to stay. They were a humble, kind group, and they immediately set to work, helping with the cleanup, the rebuilding, the cooking. They were not a burden, but a blessing. They were a part of the family, a part of the new beginning. Elara, too, found a new kind of peace. The ghost of her past, the shame of her father's debt, the fear of her family's judgment had been replaced with a profound sense of love and acceptance. She was no longer a woman on the run from her past. She was a woman who was embracing her past, and a family who had found her and who had found a home. That evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the rebuilding ranch, Elara sat with Silas on the porch. Her head was resting on his shoulder, and his arm was wrapped around her. "They're good people, Silas," she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of gratitude. "My family. They're good people." "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I can see it. Just like I saw it in you." He then leaned down and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that was a promise of a future filled with love, family, and a new kind of hope. The reunion with her family was a powerful moment of healing, a quiet, profound testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of the human heart. The ranch was not just a place where 2 wounded souls found solace, but a place where a new kind of family, a new kind of community was being built, brick by brick, heart by heart. The rebuilding of the barns continued at a furious pace, fueled by the communal effort and a shared sense of purpose. The ranch was a testament to the power of human resilience, a living, breathing symbol of a community that had found a new kind of strength in unity. Elara's family, too, found their own kind of healing. They worked tirelessly alongside the ranch hands, their hands calloused, their spirits high. They were not just a family who had found a home, but a family who had found a purpose. They had found a way to atone for their past mistakes and to build a new future. In the midst of the chaos, a new figure arrived at the ranch. He was a tall, thin man with an air of authority and a crisp, clean suit. He introduced himself as a lawyer from Harmony Gulch, a man who had heard of Silas Blackwood's reputation for honor and honesty. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice formal, "my name is Arthur Pendleton. I represent the estate of a gentleman who recently passed away. He was a man of great wealth, and he was known for his unorthodox methods." He paused, his gaze fixed on Silas. He was also known for his vendettas. A cold dread settled over Silas. He knew who the lawyer was talking about. He knew this was not a social call. This was a final, chilling message from the grave. He was a man who, in his last moments, wanted to cause a final act of malice, the lawyer continued, his voice low. He wanted to do something that would haunt you forever. He then took a document from his briefcase. It was a legal document, a bill of sale. It was the original document, the one that proved Elara was a commodity, a piece of property. In his last will and testament, he bequeathed this document to you, the lawyer said, his voice flat. As a final act of spite, he wanted you to have to live with it, to have to look at it every day, to have to know that she was and always would be a piece of paper. A cold fury simmered beneath Silas's controlled exterior. The man was a monster, a man who had lived and died by the sword of his own malice. He had lost the girl, he had lost his leverage, but he had won the final battle. He had given Silas a document that would forever be a reminder of Elara's past, a shadow that would always lurk in the corners of their home. Silas took the document, his hands trembling with a mixture of fury and despair. He looked at it, at the cold legal language that had reduced the woman he loved to a mere object. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. He had fought Thorn, he had defeated him, but he could not defeat the legal system. He could not defeat the law. Elara, who had been listening from a distance, saw the look on his face. She ran to him, her heart in her throat. "Silas, what is it?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He didn't reply. He just held up the document, his eyes filled with a raw, honest grief. Elara looked at the document, at the cold, legal language. She felt a profound sense of sadness, but she did not feel despair. She had lived a life of so much sorrow, and she had survived. She had been through fire and flood, and she had emerged with her spirit intact. She was not a piece of paper. She was a person, a woman, a wife. She then looked at Silas, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. She took the document from his hand. She looked at it, at the cold, lifeless words, and then she did something he never expected. She tore it in half. The sound of the tearing paper was a triumphant, liberating sound. She tore it again and again and again, until it was nothing more than a pile of shredded paper. She then threw it into the smoldering remains of the fire pit, and watched as it turned to ash. Silas stood there, stunned. He had been so focused on the legality of the document, on the cold, hard reality of the law. He had forgotten that the only law that mattered was the law of the heart, the law of love. Elara then looked at him, a faint, weary smile on her face. "It was just a piece of paper, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "It never had any power over me, and it never had any power over us." He looked at her, at the woman who had been a commodity and who was now a woman of such immense strength and dignity. He realized then that he had not rescued her. He had not saved her. She had saved him. She had saved him from his own despair, from his own belief that he was a man who was destined to be alone, a man who was destined to be broken. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. The ashes of the paper, the ashes of her past, floated away in the wind. A final, beautiful burial. The letter of the law had been defeated by the law of the heart, and in its place a new beginning had been born. A beginning that was not about a man and a woman, but about a love that had the power to heal, to mend, and to transform. The tearing of the bill of sale was a profoundly cathartic act. It was a symbolic end to a painful chapter and a powerful declaration of a new beginning. The ash of the document was a final burial, a last quiet goodbye to a past filled with sorrow and fear. With the legal threat now gone, Silas and Elara could focus on building their future. The ranch was a hub of activity, a place of shared purpose and a vibrant community. The men, their hands calloused, their spirits high, were working tirelessly to rebuild the barns. And the women, too, were a vital part of the effort, preparing meals, mending clothes, and caring for the children. Elara's family, too, had settled in, their presence a source of immense joy for her. They were a humble, hard-working group, and they had found a new kind of peace in the quiet rhythm of the ranch. They had found a way to atone for their past mistakes and to build a new future. In the evenings, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the rebuilding ranch, Elara and Silas would sit on the porch, their hands intertwined. They would talk about their future, about the family they would build, about the life they would live. They had a shared vision, a vision of a home that was not just a place but a sanctuary, a place of love, of hope, and of a profound peace. One evening, as they were sitting there, Silas turned to her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about my past, about Sarah." Elara's heart ached for him. She knew that the memory of his first wife, the woman who had been a symbol of his lost happiness, was a wound he still carried. "She was a good woman, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "She was a part of your life. She'll always be a part of your life." He nodded. "I know, but she was a part of my past. You're a part of my future." He then reached into his coat and pulled out a small worn photograph. It was the photograph of Sarah, a smiling, beautiful woman. He looked at it for a long moment, a sad but gentle smile on his face. "I loved her very much," he said, his voice filled with a profound sorrow. "I always will." He then looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a powerful, all-consuming love. "But I love you differently. I love you with a love that has been through fire and flood, a love that has been tested and tried. I love you with a love that is a promise of a new beginning." He then, with a profound sense of peace, placed the photograph into the fire pit, a final, quiet goodbye to a past he was ready to leave behind. He watched as the paper, the final physical remnant of a love that was gone, turned to ash. Elara's eyes filled with tears. It was a powerful, beautiful act, an act of a man who was finally, truly, ready to move on. He was not forgetting his past, but he was embracing his future. He was not forgetting the woman he had loved, but he was embracing the woman he loved now. He then took her hand and intertwined their fingers. "Let's build a future, Elara," he said, his voice a low, firm promise. "Let's build a future that is our own." The ashes of the photograph, the ashes of the past, floated away in the wind. The sound of hammers, the sound of saws, and the cheerful laughter of children filled the air. They were building a future that was not about a man and a woman, but about a love that had the power to heal, to mend, and to transform. The building of the future had begun. The final chapter of their journey, a long and arduous one, was now in sight. The barns were rebuilt, stronger and sturdier than before, a testament to the power of community and a symbol of their resilience. The ranch, once a place of solitude, was now a home, a sanctuary of love, family, and a new kind of hope. Elara's family, too, was on the mend. Her aunt and uncle had found a renewed sense of purpose, a new home, and a new life. They had found a way to repay their debt, not to Thorn, but to Silas and Elara, a debt of gratitude and love. The town, too, had changed. The rumors, the whispers, the malice had been replaced with a profound sense of respect and admiration. Silas Blackwood, the man of ice, had been transformed into a man of honor, a hero, a symbol of a man who had fought for what was right. Elara, the broken woman, had become a symbol of a woman who had found her own strength, her own voice, and her own home. One afternoon, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Silas and Elara were standing on the porch, their hands intertwined. They were watching the sunset, their hearts full, their souls at peace. "It's been a long road," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "A long road home." Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. "It has," she said, a soft smile on her face. "But it was worth it." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound and all-consuming love. "You healed me, Elara," he said, his voice filled with a raw, honest sincerity. "You came here a broken woman, but you mended me. You mended my heart, my soul, my spirit." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "And you, Silas," she said, her voice a whisper, "you gave me a home. You gave me a family. You gave me a reason to live." He then leaned in and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that was a promise of a future they would build together. A future of love, of family, of a home that was not just a place, but a sanctuary, a place of peace, of hope, and of a profound, all-consuming love. The long road home had not been easy, but it had been a road they had walked together. It was a road that had led them to each other and to a new beginning. It was a road that had taught them that the greatest treasures in life are not found in wealth or power, but in the quiet, simple beauty of love, and in the profound, all-consuming peace of a heart that has found its way home. The final harvest season at Blackwood Ranch arrived with a different kind of grace. The fields, reborn from the ashes of the fire, were a testament to the community's resilience. The air was thick with the scent of cut hay and rich, fertile earth. The days were long, filled with the rhythmic labor of a well-oiled machine. But this year, the work was no longer just about survival. It was a joyous, collective effort, fueled by a profound sense of shared purpose. Silas, a man who had once worked in stoic isolation, now moved with an easy, quiet authority among his men. He would often pause to talk, to share a laugh, or to offer a word of encouragement. He was still the master of his land, but he was also a friend, a leader, and a man who had found his way back to the world. Elara, now Mrs. Blackwood, was a constant, nurturing presence. She was no longer just the ranch's caretaker, but its heart. She and Martha, now a close friend, ran the kitchen, preparing immense meals that fueled the tireless work of the men. Elara would often ride out to the fields, a large basket of food and water in hand, her face aglow with the sun and a happiness that seemed to radiate from within. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Silas and Elara were left alone in the fields, just as they had been a year ago. The last of the hay bales were loaded, and the men had returned to the ranch for the evening meal. The air was cool and filled with the scent of a long day's work. Silas, his powerful frame covered in a fine layer of dust and sweat, looked at the work, a deep sense of satisfaction on his face. "A good harvest," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A very good harvest." Elara walked to him and gently brushed a wisp of hay from his hair. "It's the best one yet, Silas," she said, her voice filled with pride, "because we did it together, and not just us, all of us." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a powerful, all-consuming love. "You're right," he said. "You brought all this here, Elara. You brought life back to this land. You brought me back to life." He then pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, comforting beat of his heart. She had come to this ranch a broken woman, a commodity, a ghost of her past. But she was now a wife, a partner, a part of a community. She was no longer a commodity to be bought and sold. She was a woman who had found her own strength, her own voice, and her own home. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of a carriage approaching from the main road. It was not the stagecoach that usually brought mail or travelers. It was a private carriage, a fine-looking vehicle drawn by two well-groomed horses. A man and a woman, both well-dressed and carrying an air of importance, stepped out. Silas's hand instinctively went to his side, a silent gesture of protection. The threat of Thorn was gone, but the world was still a dangerous place. The man, a tall, imposing figure with a well-trimmed beard, looked at them, his eyes scanning the fields, the rebuilding barns. He then looked at Elara, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Elara Vance?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and surprise. "Is that really you? My God, you're alive!" Elara's heart pounded. She didn't recognize him. He was not a part of her immediate family. He was a stranger, a ghost from a past she thought she had finally laid to rest. "Who are you?" Silas asked, his voice a low growl, his arm protectively wrapped around Elara's waist. "My name is Edward Vance," the man said, his gaze fixed on Elara. "I'm her father's cousin, a distant cousin. We haven't seen each other since we were children. We heard what happened. We were told you were dead, that you had perished in the fire. We've been looking for you. For years. He then looked at Silas, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "And who are you, sir? And what business do you have with my cousin?" Silas's jaw tightened. The suspicion in the man's voice was a familiar, unwelcome sound. "My name is Silas Blackwood. I'm her husband." The man's face, once filled with hope, now turned to a mask of shock and disbelief. Her husband? My God! This is unbelievable. This is impossible. We were told you were a villain, a monster. We heard terrible things. Elara stepped forward, her hand on Silas's arm. "He is not a villain, Edward," she said, her voice firm. "He is a good man, the best man I've ever known. He saved my life." Edward Vance, however, was not convinced. He had come on a long journey, filled with hope of finding a lost relative, and he was now faced with a reality that was completely at odds with the story he had been told. He had been told a story of a helpless girl in the clutches of a cruel, reclusive man. He was now faced with a woman who was clearly loved and a man who was her protector, her partner, her husband. He then looked at his wife, a kind, gentle woman who had been silent throughout the conversation. She had been watching Elara and Silas, and in their quiet affection, in their profound connection, she had seen the truth. "Edward," she said, her voice a soft whisper. "Look at her. Look at them. They're happy. They're in love. The stories. They were just stories." Edward's face softened. He looked at Elara, and he saw the woman he remembered from his childhood, a woman with a kind heart and a spirit of fire. He then looked at Silas, a man who, despite his tough exterior, was clearly a man of immense strength and honor. He saw the love in his eyes, the quiet, powerful love that had been a silent witness to their journey. He walked to Silas and extended a hand, this time with a profound sense of respect. "I apologize, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice filled with humility. "I have been a fool. I have been led astray by a man who was a master of deceit. I am so sorry for my words." Silas shook his hand, a firm, warm handshake. "No harm done," he said. "The man who told you those stories, he's gone. He's a part of our past." Elara then walked to her cousin and his wife, and she embraced them. "Welcome home," she said, a profound sense of peace in her heart. "Welcome to our home." The two families, once so distant, so separate, were now united by a shared history, a shared sorrow, and a shared hope for the future. The final harvest was not just a collection of crops, it was a harvest of love, a harvest of forgiveness, and a harvest of a new beautiful beginning. The long road home was finally over, and a new life had begun, a life that was not about a man and a woman, but about a family, a community, and a love that had the power to heal, to mend, and to transform. The arrival of Elara's distant family was a powerful moment of reconciliation, a quiet testament to the enduring bonds of kin. Edward and his wife, a kind, gentle woman named Eleanor, were welcomed into the fold of Blackwood Ranch, a new family unit that had been forged not by blood, but by love and a shared history of sorrow and resilience. Edward, a man who had been a quiet, unassuming figure in his own life, was profoundly moved by the sense of community at the ranch. He saw the way the men worked together, the way they supported one another. He saw the love between Elara and Silas, a love that was a quiet, powerful force. He saw a man who had been painted as a monster, and he saw a man of honor, a man of courage, a man who had found his way back to the world. He spent his days working alongside the men, learning the rhythms of the ranch, his hands, once so clean, now calloused and rough. He was not just a visitor, he was a part of the family, a part of the rebuilding, a part of the new beginning. Eleanor, too, found a place for herself. She and Elara would spend their days in the kitchen, their hands working in tandem, their voices a soft, gentle melody of conversation and laughter. They would talk about their past, about their shared history, and about the new future they were now building together. One evening, as the stars began to appear, a blanket of glittering pinpricks of light in the vast darkness, Elara sat with Silas on the porch. She was resting her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. "They're good people, Silas," she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of gratitude. "My family, they're good people." "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I can see it. But you know, Elara, family is not just about blood. It's about who you choose. And we've chosen a good family, you and I. Elara looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "I know," she said. "We have." She then looked at the ranch, at the men sitting around a bonfire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. She saw her family, her aunt and uncle sitting there, a part of the conversation, a part of the community. She saw Martha, a woman who had been a mother to her in this new life, a woman who had been a quiet, unwavering source of support. She saw Caleb, the young man who had been a pawn in a game of greed, now a man with a purpose, a man who was building a new life for himself. She saw all the people who had come into her life, not by choice, but by fate. And she saw how they had all come together, a beautiful, imperfect tapestry of a family. She realized then that her life had not been a series of misfortunes, but a series of quiet blessings. The auction block, the dust storm, the fire, the legal battles, had all been a part of a larger, more profound journey. A journey that had led her to a place she could call home, to a man she could call husband, and to a family she could call her own. The next morning, Edward and Eleanor, their hearts full, their spirits renewed, came to them. "We've decided," Edward said, his voice filled with a profound sense of peace. "We're not leaving. We're staying. If you'll have us, of course." Elara and Silas's faces lit up with joy. They were not just a couple, they were now a family that had been forged in the fires of adversity, a family that had found its way home. The family, both by blood and by choice, was now a complete circle. They were a community, a sanctuary, a place of love, of hope, and of a profound peace. The past, with all its shadows and its sorrows, was now just a distant memory. The future was a bright, beautiful canvas, waiting to be painted. And the family together was ready to paint it. They were a family that had been broken, but now they were a family that was whole. They were a family that had been lost, but now they were a family that had found their way home. The ranch, now a bustling hub of life, was a testament to the power of community, love, and forgiveness. The final harvest was a resounding success, and the new barns, sturdier and more beautiful than the ones that had been lost, were a symbol of a new beginning. Silas and Elara, now Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, were no longer just a couple. They were the heart of the community, the silent, unwavering force that held everything together. They were the family who had found a home, and the home that had found a family. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Elara and Silas sat on the porch, their hands intertwined. It was a moment of quiet peace, a moment of profound gratitude. "Do you ever think about the past?" Elara asked, her voice soft. "About Redemption Creek, about the auction?" Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a powerful, all-consuming love. "I do," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I think about the day I met you. I think about the courage you had, the strength, the dignity. I think about how a broken woman could have so much light in her soul." Elara's eyes filled with tears. "And I think about the man who saved me," she said, her voice a whisper. "The man who gave me a new name, a new life, a new home. The man who taught me how to love again." He leaned in and gently kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that was a promise of a future they would build together. A future of love, of family, of a home that was not just a place but a sanctuary, a place of peace, of hope, and of a profound, all-consuming love. The journey was over. The long, arduous road that had led them to each other, a road filled with so much sorrow and so much pain, had finally come to an end. But a new life had just begun. A life that was not about a man and a woman, but about a family, a community, and a love that had the power to heal, to mend, and to transform. The long road home had not been easy, but it had been a road they had walked together. It was a road that had led them to each other and to a new beginning. It was a road that had taught them that the greatest treasures in life are not found in wealth or power, but in the quiet, simple beauty of love and in the profound, all-consuming peace of a heart that has found its way home. The journey was over. The life was just beginning. The end of the story was not an end at all. It was just a new chapter, a new beginning, a new life, a new home. A new chapter in a story of a love that had been through fire and flood and had emerged with a spirit intact. A story of a love that was a testament to the power of a heart that has found its way home. And in the quiet, gentle rhythm of the ranch, a new life was beginning. A life that was a promise of a future filled with love, family, and a new kind of hope.